There's no denying the 90s gave us an endless supply of timeless movies. The decade was one of cinematic experimentation, and Hollywood gave us a bit of it all on the big screen with a ton of unforgettable hits. However, from B movies to unseen indies to studio films that maybe came and went before they caught your attention, the 90s also has a wealth of lost cinema. I'm Anthony DeJoya, and this is Movies Never Say Die, your one-stop shop for retro movie content, and you'll want to get comfortable today because we're diving into 100 lost movies from the 1990s. This crime drama follows a kingpin who wants to run the city and the cops who will try to stop him his way. When Christopher Walken would star as Frank White and Abel Ferrara's King of New York from 1990, also starring Lawrence Fishburne, David Caruso, Wesley Snipes, Victor Argo, and many other familiar faces. Now, King of New York is often overshadowed by other crime dramas of the era, but I think this film's bold, uncompromising vision and Walken's electrifying performance do make it a standout. I think Walken delivers a riveting performance as Frank White, a ruthless drug lord recently released from prison that's just determined and hell-bent to reclaim his throne and dismantle the city's corrupt establishment. I think Walken's portrayal is very menacing as well as very charismatic, which does drive the film's overall energy and mood. I think this film really excels in its depiction of moral ambiguity and urban decay, skillfully blending visceral action with a contemplative look at power and redemption. I think Abel Ferrara's direction really does bring a raw realism that does enhance this film's immersive quality. The supporting cast with names like Fishburne, Caruso, Snipes, and others all provide strong performances that are able to complement Walken's magnetic lead. The music is certainly the pulse of this story and just the tone of the film overall, and I think its contemporary veneer gives it a timeless appeal. This sports comedy would feature some of the hottest action on the slopes when Dave Marshak and the Misfits from Section 8 would rage all over the mountains. In Ski School from 1991, directed by Damian Lee, starring Dean Cameron, Stuart Fratkin, Tom Bresnahan, and Darlene Vogel. I think Ski School is just a delightfully lighthearted raunch-com that perfectly captures the laid-back spirit of the 80s fringe comedy that was filled with just waves of gratuitous nudity and tons of amazing, albeit juvenile humor. This movie really, I think, thrives on its irreverent atmosphere and a predictable but very playful storyline. There's a fun mix of comical situations and slapstick gags and cheeky one-liners and a generous dose of skiing action that I think is all surprisingly well shot and still visually impressive all these years later. Ski School is certainly a film that aims to entertain rather than innovate, but its charms do lie with its easygoing vibe and just the chemistry amongst the cast that's led by Cameron and Fratkin, who are so good together in this movie. You can tell they really get along. They're having fun. They each bring their own level of charisma. They certainly sell all this silly material more than enough to have fun with this movie. There's also a subtle wittiness to some of the spots of the crude humor, and overall this movie just lands a lot more laughs than those that fall flat. And really, I think Ski School is the perfect watch for those just seeking a party and sex-fueled escape film out on the slopes. This crime thriller is set in a normal town on a normal street, and it follows a common girl whose new roommate is about to borrow a few things without asking, such as her clothes, her boyfriend, and her life. In Single White Female from 1992, directed by Barbette Schroeder, starring Bridget Fonda and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Now, this is just a taut psychological thriller that really delves into the darkness of human infatuation with loads of intrigue. I think Lee delivers an absolutely chilling performance as the deranged and unstable roommate, capturing the essence of a character whose outward charm completely masks this deeply unsettling nature. I think her portrayal really anchors the film's suspenseful atmosphere without question, while Fonda is able to step in and provide a solid counterpart by playing it straight as the unwitting victim drawn into this deadly psychological nightmare. The Story overall, it's serviceable. It doesn't quite match the level of intensity and the range that the performances from Lee and Fonda capture, but it is filled with plenty of suspenseful situations to have you on edge. This film really lives in the shadows, so there's an unnerving, ominous atmosphere while the story moves along. And sure, it tries to do a little too much and maybe doesn't lean into the sinister psychology of things as much as it could have, but Single White Female is still a great entry in the golden age of the erotic thriller. Next up is a sports dramedy about a teenager from California who ventures out to Ohio, where he of course runs into the wrong crowd when he crosses the hockey team in 1993's rollerblading action drama Airborne from Rod Bowman, starring Shane McDermott, Seth Green, Brittany Powell, and Jack Black. While it doesn't reinvent the wheel, Airborne is a charming teen sports action adventure flick that just captures the essence of 90s youth culture and blends it with just high adrenaline rollerblading scenes. The Airborne's appeal certainly is driven by, I think, its energetic rollerblading sequences and the camaraderie displayed amongst its younger cast during the movie's quieter moments. This movie doesn't really delve deeply into complex emotional themes, but I think it succeeds in just delivering an endearing, coming-of-age, feel-good 90s fueled experience. It's a lighthearted narrative, and its engaging performances, particularly from McDermott's laid-back charm, do make it an enjoyable watch for those just seeking a fun, nostalgic throwback to 90s teen comedies. And while it may not be groundbreaking, I do think Airborne takes itself seriously enough to result in a spirited and entertaining film that captures the carefree fun of its era, complete with an energetic soundtrack and loads of rollerblading action. Written and directed by Adam Rifkin, this action comedy features a high-speed chase for the border like no other when an escaped convict takes a young woman hostage with a candy bar in 1994's The Chase, starring Charlie Sheen, Christy Swanson, Henry Rollins, Ray Wise, and a comedic ensemble of supporting players. I think The Chase is such an underrated action comedy. Charlie Sheen stars as a charming and bumbling, but also quick-witted convict on the run. This film kicks off with Sheen's audacious escape from a convenience store using a Butterfinger candy bar. This leads to a hijacked car, taking its unsuspecting owner. And from there, this movie is a non-stop, comedically chaotic pursuit that just blends slapstick comedy with adrenaline-pumping action so well. I think Sheen is awesome in this movie. He has this great balance of charm and roguish humor. Swanson's effective as well, and this film truly does, I think, thrives on its fast-paced plot, its comedic banter, and it's all supported by a lively ensemble cast featuring names like Anthony Kiedis, Flea, the ever-reliable Ray Wise, and many others. The Chase is far from groundbreaking, but the sense of humor in the writing, I think, is just so keyed into the story beats and the characters. This movie just creates a feel-good atmosphere, and it's a textbook definition of 90s escapist cinema. This next film asks you to question the knowledge when students from 49 countries of 6 races and 2 sexes would converge on one campus in John Singleton's Higher Learning from 1995, starring a star-studded cast led by Ice Cube, Michael Rappaport, Omar Epps, Regina King, and many, many others. A film that still resonates so much today. I think Higher Learning is a powerful drama that explores the complexities of college life through a multifaceted lens. This film's scope is truly ambitious. It tackles themes of race and politics, sexual identity, social justice, radical mentality, as well as assault, all with a very raw and unflinching eye. I think the narrative in this film is both compelling and confrontational, just offering a blunt examination of prejudice as well as the quest for self-discovery, both good and bad. The performances from this younger cast, I think, are impressive across the board, with Epps and Rappaport delivering particularly impactful portrayals of their complex characters, although Rappaport, who is just haunting in this role, certainly does steal the spotlight. And while Higher Learning occasionally veers into the melodrama, I think it absolutely succeeds in sparking important conversations about the issues facing students and society. This movie's gripping, it's thought-provoking, it's heartbreaking, and overall, it's a significant exploration of modern American campus life and all of its underlying tensions. Next up is a wild sports comedy about a couple of super fanatics who kidnap the star player of the opposing team to help their home team win a championship. In Celtic Pride from 1996, directed by Tom DeSergio, starring Daniel Stern, Damon Wayans, and Dan Aykroyd. Though the plot may seem far-fetched and the humor more than occasionally veers into the absurd, Celtic Pride is a movie that absolutely succeeds in its primary goal. That is, providing a lighthearted and entertaining take on sports fanaticism through a heavily comedic lens. This film's playful tone and its energetic performances make it a fun, if slightly predictable comedy. I think this movie really thrives on the comical chemistry between Stern and Aykroyd, who deliver just spirited, high-energy performances as the bumbling yet well-meaning fans. Damon Wayans also adds to the fun with his charismatic portrayal of the kidnapped player who quickly turns the table on his captors in truly comical fashion. Now, not all of the humor works here, but much of it does, and the unique appeal in this plot is undeniable. I think Stern and Aykroyd and Wayans are a great trio. They all go in on these roles for the best, and fans of sports comedy will certainly find Celtic Pride a nostalgic and amusing look at the lengths to which people will go to support their teams. Moving along, this next high school set thriller is about a teacher who returns to the job after being stabbed, and when he does, he finds his limits have been pushed and that the wolves must be tamed. In 1997's 187, directed by Kevin Reynolds, starring Samuel L. Jackson, Kelly Rowan, and Clifton Collins Jr. To me, this is a movie that 100% excels through its raw and unflinching depiction as it explores all the challenges faced by educators in tougher environments. This film's dark and realistic tone, combined with Jackson's compelling lead performance, make it a memorable and very thought-provoking entry in the very busy genre of 90s high school thrillers. I think Jackson is just fantastic in this movie overall. He delivers a powerful and nuanced turn, just capturing the character's complex blend of empathy and frustration and disillusion and resolve. His portrayal really does drive the film's emotional core. He does make the audience feel the weight of his character's moral and just personal dilemmas, and it's just a great time to see Jackson earlier in his career playing a character as opposed to just playing himself and everything. But for as good as his performance is in this film, it's equally countered by Collins Jr., who just delivers a knockout character for the needs of this story. 187 overall does have some pacing issues, and its intense subject matter may not be so much fun for some viewers to engage with, but I do think the film's powerful message about resilience and hope actually shine brighter in the face of this plot's tragedies. This next action thriller centers around a group of sea scavengers who board a luxury ocean liner to hijack it, but instead run into the gnarliest beast they've ever seen in Stephen Sommers' Deep Rising from 1998, starring Treat Williams, Famke Janssen, and a supporting cast of familiar faces from the era. I always have fun when I'm watching this movie. It's an action horror adventure that combines high seas thrills with a delightfully over-the-top supernatural twist. Deep Rising just overall delivers a high-energy mix of suspense and action and loads of campy humor. I think Treat Williams brings a sense of charm and bravado to this role, effectively anchoring the film's more outlandish moments. I think Famke Janssen kicks ass in this movie as well. The special effects, while dated by today's standards, I think do offer a fun, spectacle-filled visual experience, particularly in the depiction of the monstrous sea creature that wreaks havoc on this ship. And overall, I think Deep Rising is just an entertaining blend of genre elements, from the tension of a heist gone awry to the excitement and chaos of monster mayhem, all within the confines of a ship. And it's all a great time, and while it may not break new ground in the action or horror genres, its playful approach and its fast-paced narrative make it a guilty pleasure for fans of 90s creature features. This 70s set comedy follows a kid from Pawtucket named Tim. Tim and his friends have been busted by the local police one too many times, so Tim's getting sent off to boarding school instead of jail in 1999's Outside Providence, directed by Michael Corrente, starring Sean Hatosi, Amy Smart, and Alec Baldwin. This often forgotten coming-of-age dramedy captures the tumultuous journey of a young man growing up into his own in the 70s. This movie skillfully balances a variety of attempts at humor with heartfelt drama, exploring themes of self-discovery and family and class structure and the quest for identity. Hitoshi delivers a nuanced performance in the lead, capturing his character's blend of rebelliousness and wanting for more and his vulnerability, all while keeping his youthful charm. The supporting cast, including names like Smart and Baldwin, also add depth to the story with their engaging portrayal of these everyday characters. And this is certainly, to me at least, one of those just homey comedies that has a lived-in charm to it. The script overall provides a nostalgic look at adolescence, punctuated with a lot of witty dialogue and a period-appropriate soundtrack. And while Outside Providence does tread a lot of familiar territory in its exploration of teen angst and personal growth, its charm does lie in its authentic portrayal of a young man's journey from delinquency to self-realization. First up is a demonic action thriller that feels straight out of the 80s in all of the ways that you would hope. Satan has created the perfect killer, one that cannot be stopped. In The First Power from 1990, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, Tracy Griffith, and Jeff Kober, written and directed by Robert Reznikoff. I think The First Power is a solid supernatural thriller that blends horror and crime and action and the occult into just a fun, nostalgic ride through the grim streets of Los Angeles. I think director Robert Reznikoff really infuses this movie with the gritty and at times noirish feel, complete with shadowy alleys and ominous rituals and a continual sense of dread that all do work well in this film's entertainment value overall. I think Lou Diamond Phillips delivers a great performance. He convincingly portrays this man who's just pushed to the limits by an enemy that he can barely comprehend, let alone defeat. And then there's Korber, whose portrayal as this resurrected killer is chilling. He's clearly having fun in this role. His manic energy, to me, really does add a layer of unpredictability to the film's suspense. And overall, The First Power's blend of crime thriller, horror, and action offers something different from the typical slasher and action fare from the era, making it an underrated entry in the genre despite some comical overacting by Tracy Griffith. Next up is a maximum comedy at minimum wage when the town storyteller takes the job that nobody wanted and ended up with the girl that everybody did. In 1991's Career Opportunities, starring Frank Whaley, Jennifer Connelly, and Dermot Mulroney, from the mind of John Hughes, directed by Brian Gordon. Now, Career Opportunities is far from John Hughes' best work. In fact, he actually let it be known that he wanted his name removed from this movie altogether upon its release. However, I think despite its limitations, that it's still a charming little comedy with a jovial energy to it that can just lure you in. I remember seeing this movie so many times as a kid. It gave me dreams of working nights at Target, and luckily as I got older, my aspirations grew a little bit, but regardless of that, it made overnights at the department store look like so much fun. There's so much charisma from the performance from Whaley that you can't help but love this bumbling character. I'll admit he's a bit too much Ferris Bueller in spots, but Whaley certainly does make the character his own. His delivery of the tall tales is amusing. You never know what this guy's going to say or do next, which is just kind of adds to the fun. Then you get Jennifer Connelly, who does have her moments. Admittedly, her character is underwritten, and after the montages and the collection of jokes, the story doesn't really know what to do with itself. But regardless of all that, this is a lovable comedic gem from the early 90s that still holds up. This comedy follows a con man that can resist anything but love and money, and that's something he's going to have to choose between in Peter McDonald's Mo Money from 1992, written by and starring Damon Wayans, along with his little brother Marlon Wayans, and Stacey Dash and John Deal. To me, Mo Money is an energized movie that delivers a blend of full-throttle comedy with high-energy action and a picture-perfect 90s soundtrack. Admittedly, this one plays like an extended music video, which I think actually in this case does help the film have a fun, engaging atmosphere that is able to make all the excess of style and action and attempts at humor and melodrama just a fun-loving adventure with a swift pace. I think Damon Wayans is able to blend his relentless humor with a capable action persona. He does feel a little too cool under pressure at times, which doesn't help the already artificial feel of this plot, but it certainly isn't a deal breaker. He and his brother Marlon are hilarious. They effortlessly sell the fast talking street hustler personas as they get in over their heads in this credit card scheme. And sure, it's all surface level, but it is plenty engaging. I think Stacey Dash is engaging, and so it's easy to understand forging credit cards to try and impress her. I watched this movie so many times in the second run theater, then at home on cable. It's stylish, it's sexy, and it still entertains today. This sports action drama follows a couple of small-town friends looking to discover the spirit of skiing who end up finding wealth and seduction, teaching them that when you're in Aspen, skiing is the easy part. In 1993's Aspen Extreme, starring Paul Gross, Peter Berg, and Terry Polo, written and directed by Patrick Hasberg. Personally, I think Aspen Extreme is a heavily undermentioned film when it comes to sports dramas. Sure, it delivers in excess of melodrama, but that isn't to say that the story, its plot beats, and the character arcs aren't still written with a heartfelt sincerity and a certain level of authenticity. I think this movie really captures the journey of friendship. It really cuts it with the determination of striving for a better life, as well as showing how taking that risk and taking that chance can go both good and not so good. The movie does certainly have contrasting tones. There are some dark and intentionally heavy-handed moments. Then there are some blatantly superficial moments, and it may not work for everyone to their movie taste. This film really does play on your elementary level emotions, but that's also why it's so easy to get lost in. I think Gross and Berg are both natural for their roles. Their chemistry captures the bond between them effectively. I think Terry Polo really cements the cast with a grounded performance, much like Berg, who just has a very tough go in this movie. Plus, I think the skiing action is excellently shot, which results in a movie that delivers a bit of it all for the genre. Next up is a coming-of-age dramedy about love in the 90s when a filmmaker and her Gen X friends navigate post-life college in Reality Bites from 1994, starring Winona Ryder, Ethan Hawke, Janine Garofalo, Steve Zahn, and Ben Stiller, who also directed. When this movie was released, Ben Stiller steered away from the Gen X label in hopes of appealing to a wider audience, of course, but there's no denying that Reality Bites is a young adult Gen X story, and it's a damn good one as it explores the lives of post-college friends and the next steps in their lives. This movie really resonated with me so much. I remember seeing this one when I was a junior in high school, and it really just connected with me as a kid who didn't really know what his place in this world was. There was a little something in each of these characters to connect with, so you can, I think, really invest in this group, and with smart writing that doesn't try to embellish for the sake of melodrama, that you can easily immerse yourself in the real life vibe of these plot layers. I think the performances overall are fantastic, not perfect, which in this case is actually perfect for the needs of these just grounded real life characters. I think Stiller's direction is intimate and inviting, and the music is just the energizer to it all, in a film that has gone on to become a certified cult classic for very good reason. Now, this is a full feature film based on the HBO anthology series, and it centers on a group of people trapped in a rundown church. On the same night, a powerful presence will show itself in 1995's Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight, starring Jada Pinkett, before she was Smith, William Sadler, Dick Miller, and Billy Zane, from director Ernest R. Dickerson. I think many would agree that it's not easy to pull off horror and comedy in one film. Many try, but many also fail. However, to me, Demon Knight is one of those that succeeds by delivering a bold, vibrant, lived-in story that can easily lure you in, as well as cutting it with a sadistic little sense of humor. This movie also really thrives with its ominous atmosphere. I think the dark, rainy settings and the singular location are perfect for the fast-moving story that can just keep you on edge. I think the ensemble cast is great for the needs of this plot. I think everybody really gets their moments to shine or leave an impression on the film. Sure, you can assume who the easily expendable characters are, but there are still plenty of surprises as the intensity ramps up and the body count increases. But I think really where this movie thrives is just in its over-the-top zeal. Demon Knight knows what it is. It goes all in on that. The quieter moments are driven by the cast and just enough character plotting, and it's cut with intense surges of violence and spectacle. The carnage is delightfully sadistic. The humor is as well, and I think this movie still kicks ass. This moody, dramatic thriller is set in the aftermath of a massive blackout as people reconsider what is necessary, what is questionable, and what is legal to survive. And David Kopp's The Trigger Effect from 1996, starring Elizabeth Shue, Kyle MacLachlan, Dermot Mulroney, Richard Jones, and Michael Rooker. This is another of those movies that will certainly not be to everybody's taste. It was given a limited release back in '96 and it never really took off. It explores the concept of humans being unable to cohabitate without technology. However, some may view the exploration as one that delivers a great potential idea only to maybe follow through on it with just a surface level lens. I will admit the focal characters are underwritten. The finale doesn't go nearly as hard as it should have. However, despite the sanitized closing, I do think that The Trigger Effect provides 90% of an engrossing film. There's a surreal uneasiness about this movie that really works in its favor as you constantly feel like something bad is going to happen. I remember seeing this movie back in the theater when I was younger. I didn't really know what to think about it at the time. I gave it a shot and it didn't really grab me then. I have seen it a few times as I've gotten older, and I think it's actually a great watch when you're in the mood for an extremely grounded story that sort of plays like real life without the studio spectacle. This next comedy showcases a charming cast when a street hustler on the run from the cops and the criminals strikes a deal with a TV newsman whose career is starting to flounder in exchange for protection in 1997's Money Talks, starring Chris Tucker, Charlie Sheen, Heather Locklear, and Paul Sorvino. This was a movie that was definitely not so well received by critics when it was released, and I will admit that this plot and these characters and this theme of comedy is probably a decade too late. But still, I think Money Talks is just a delightfully silly comedy that delivers plenty of mindless laughs. I think Chris Tucker is definitely the driving force of the comedic tone, but Charlie Sheen also showcases his comedic timing as well. I will admit they aren't the best duo overall. I do think their best moments are probably individual in this film, but they still manage to infuse this silly comedy with plenty of laughs and mindless fun. I think Paul Sorvino lands a lot of laughs. Heather Locklear also makes the most of a basic character, and overall, the fast pace of this movie really does work in its favor. It's not a laugh out loud comedy. It has some very humorous moments, but it does lay the groundwork for a free-spirited and lighthearted action comedy that does land more laughs than it whiffs on. And sure, Money Talks is by the numbers. It's predictable, it's forgettable, but it's also an easily consumable comedy that you can have fun with for a tight 96 minutes. Next up is a dark comedy that follows a group of friends who head out to Vegas for the bachelor party of their lives, but when a prostitute is accidentally killed, they all turn on each other. In Very Bad Things from 1998, starring Christian Slater, Daniel Stern, Cameron Diaz, Jon Favreau, and a few other familiar faces. This movie was a financial and critical flop, and many people would say deservedly so. However, I contend that if you look at Very Bad Things as a horror comedy and a pure horror comedy and not simply just a dark comedy, then the mean-spirited humor in this film does land in a much more defiantly jovial way. This movie is way over the top. It's super violent and unsettling. It will turn many people off, but on the other side of the coin, it also has a sharp and sadistic sense of humor. The performances go all in, and its unrelenting lack of morality is something you can easily just sit back and laugh at while still not really liking any of the characters or agreeing with their decisions. But to me, that's kind of the point. I mean, Very Bad Things is set in a hyper-realistic setting that spirals out of control and even more hyper-realistic ways, just getting worse and worse. I remember bringing this movie to a girl's house that I was really into at the time. She was a tad reserved, and I didn't know about this movie, but it had Slater and Diaz in it, so I figured, what the hell? Needless to say, this movie can still entertain all these years later in a very absurd way, but I never heard from that girl again after that night. This next movie delivers a little bit of everything after a botched drug deal is explored from 3 different points of view in Doug Liman's crime comedy Go from 1999, starring a great ensemble cast featuring Sarah Polley, Jay Moore, Scott Wolf, Katie Holmes, Taye Diggs, Timothy Oliphant, and others. Movies built on separate stories or points of view all running at the same time can often run into issues, most notably being continuity, but Doug Liman's Go, on the contrary, is a master class in telling multiple angles of the same event that are all connected with precision when the time comes. First, Go has a fantastic cast. There are so many familiar faces in this film, and with such a broad variety of personalities, there's really something for everybody to connect with. But really what makes this movie great is the smart writing, the clever humor, and just the crisp, tight pacing. This movie shoots out of the gate, and from there it really just throws story layers at you, each with their own mood, all filled with their own interesting characters and their own character dynamics. This is all set to high energy music from the era, and it just makes Go a roller coaster ride of screw ups, close calls, bad choices, and with a variety of comedic tones. It still makes this movie unlike few others all these years later. This comedy came out in 1990, and it stars James Belushi as Jimmy Dworsky, a regular guy who loves sports and is about to finish a short jail sentence. Jimmy Dworsky is about to get a new life. The only problem is it's somebody else's life in Arthur Hiller's Taking Care of Business, also starring Charles Grodin. Many of you in the UK may know this movie as Filofax, but here in the States it was called Taking Care of Business, and I still think it's a fun, feel-good comedy that certainly does have its flaws, but still easily manages a great time while watching, primarily I think because of the fast pace that this silly plot explores, and just from the charm delivered by this likable cast. I think James Belushi is just perfect as this common guy who, despite being a little bit schmucky, is a good-hearted dude that just wants to see his team play in the World Series, and seeing him do anything he can to attain that is a comical ride. Then you get Charles Grodin, who plays it much more grounded to deliver his own type of humor, and I think together they're a capable comedic duo for the needs of this movie. Belushi stumbles into this guy's life and everything works in his favor, and Grodin sees his life disappear with anything that can go wrong going wrong, and it's a mindless blast that delivers a high energy ending that still holds up as a charming comedy all these years later. Now, this horror movie centers on that one house in the neighborhood that the adults would whisper about and the kids would cross the street to pass in 1991's The People Under the Stairs, written and directed by Wes Craven, starring Brandon Adams, Everett McGill, Wendy Robbie, and AJ Langer. I can see where The People Under the Stairs may be a little too out there for some of you, but I do contend that if you give this movie a chance and overlook some of its silliness, that this is a fun, effective haunted house flick that has solid moments of suspense, moments of unnerving tension, and a light dose of humor to just cut the evil atmosphere of this story to deliver a fun, wild ride of horror and frights. I think the cast overall is solid, primarily from McGill and Robbie, who just absolutely capture the cartoonish insanity of these over-the-top characters to a T. They're both completely unhinged in this movie, and as a young teen and as a kid watching this movie, they always creeped me out. The makeup effects, I think, are still effective in creating the eeriness of these people living in the walls, and I think this suburban home just serves as a great playground for the close quarter horrors and thrills. But really what makes this movie so much fun is that I think it knows what it is. The story between all the suspenseful action is very short and sweet and effective. It really connects the demented chaos of this simple plot more than enough to make this movie a great time every Halloween season. This action comedy follows George Cuffs. He didn't graduate high school and he just lost his job, but when his brother is killed in the line of duty, he inherits a small patrol district in 1992's Cuffs, directed by Bruce A. Evans, starring Christian Slater, Mila Jovovich, Tony Goldwyn, and Leon Rippey. This was a movie that I watched countless times as a kid, being a huge Slater fan, and to this day I still think the mix of action and comedy that Cuffs delivers is a fun time. This one feels like a 80s action movie cut with an early 90s comedy, complete with Slater's character routinely breaking the fourth wall to bring that slight Ferris Bueller touch to things, which does pull you into the story with him. And sure, there are some contrasting tones in this movie. Spots really intend to hit the heartstrings, others aim for mindless laughs, but that's also kind of just part of the nostalgia that this movie brings. It's a silly story for sure, but the movie is clearly having fun with itself. I think Slater is comfortable and capable in the lead, and I think Leon Rippey as the eccentric Kane is a treat. The villain in this movie is cartoonish as he wears shirts with his own picture on it, yet it all just, I think, blends into the light atmosphere and vibe of this movie overall. I think it's tightly paced, and with a balance of action set pieces and a jovial sense of humor, Cuffs has just a simplistic charm that still holds up. Next up is a mystery thriller that asks, if someone you loved mysteriously vanished, how far would you go to find them? In The Vanishing from 1993, directed by George Sluizer, starring Jeff Bridges, Kiefer Sutherland, and Nancy Travis. I was born in Los Angeles, and I lived there as a kid with my grandmother until the crack epidemic of the 80s came around and made the neighborhood far too dangerous, so she moved me up to the sticks of Washington to live with my aunt and uncle in a little town called Snohomish. The Vanishing was actually partially filmed in my town. I remember seeing where they were filming parts of this movie, and I still contend that this is an intriguingly ominous and moody thriller. I think Sutherland really captures the desperation of a normal man searching for answers, and Jeff Bridges is just plenty eerie but still unassuming, and I think seeing the layers of his evil peel back in this movie is a suspenseful and emotionally gripping escape. I haven't seen the original, and I have heard that it is a superior film with a much darker ending, but as it is, this movie does have its appeal. I think it's very well acted. The emotional pull is more than effective, and I think Sluizer's direction is foreboding and dramatic when needed to give the story the proper ebbs and flows of emotional tones. The Vanishing may have its issue. It may bumble the ending a tad as well, but it still delivers a dramatic ride that will have you asking how far you would go to find a missing loved one. This next movie was an inside look at college basketball, where victory doesn't come cheap, and if you're going to win at any cost, you're going to have to be prepared to pay the price. In Blue Chips from 1994, directed by William Friedkin, starring Nick Nolte, J.T. Walsh, Mary McDonald, and Ed O'Neill. I've always been a sports fan, specifically of basketball, football, and baseball, and I really loved Blue Chips as a teenager who had dreams of playing college basketball and maybe going pro. The Sonics never called me up to be their starting point guard, and at the time this movie was released, it wasn't so well received, but I think it's just because it was ahead of its time. The movie, not me. I'm Italian and short, not really NBA material, but when this movie was released, college basketball and football was just blowing up. TV deals were bringing in millions of dollars, and I don't think people were really interested in a peek behind the scenes at the business of college basketball and college sports. But all these years later, as a reflective look back, I think Blue Chips is a very much a stronger watch, really, as it just pulls the curtain back just enough to create an intriguing story that does focus more on the morality points than it does the business aspects. I think Nolte is solid in the lead as a fiery veteran coach that finds the business of basketball changing all around him. There are also a lot of NBA players in this film to make the basketball feel legit, and Blue Chips isn't necessarily a Moneyball level expose on the inner workings of college sports, but like the program did for football, it delivers just enough substance to blend with its Hollywood storytelling to result in a film that can still deliver an entertaining watch all these years later. Next up is a truly one-of-a-kind movie from 1995 about a data courier with information inside of his head that he must deliver before dying, in Johnny Mnemonic, starring Keanu Reeves, Dina Meyer, Ice-T, and Dolph Lundgren as the street preacher, directed by Robert Longo. Something that I always loved about 80s and 90s movies were those random films that took a chance, swung for the fences to make something completely odd and unique, and few films fit into that category as easily as I think Johnny Mnemonic does. This movie is just wild and eccentric and bonkers in so many amazing ways. The story is equally ridiculous and interesting. The cast overall is a strong ensemble. You get Reeves in the lead, who's just great. He's showcasing a perfect level of self-awareness. Then you get the tertiary characters from Meyer and Rollins and Ice-T, who all add their own flavor to their characters. Then on the villain side, you get the talents of Dolph Lundgren, who just goes all in on this performance as the street preacher. So the ensemble here is excellent. Then you just toss them all into this futuristic cyberpunk setting and you give them a high tension mission, and the result is a true escape of bizarre style, violent action, and charismatic performances that know exactly what this movie was supposed to be, and the result is a cult classic from Keanu Reeves that doesn't get mentioned enough. Coming up next is a tense thriller that explored the dangers of extreme fanaticism when a superstar baseball player finds his life just turned upside down, in Tony Scott's loose remake of The Fan from 1996, starring Wesley Snipes, Robert De Niro, Ellen Barkin, and John Leguizamo. I've always been a fan of Wesley Snipes and Robert De Niro, so I remember seeing this movie in theaters and I absolutely loved it, and I still enjoy it today. I think The Fan essentially delivers the complete package for those looking for a mid-90s thriller that thrives on its style, its leading stars, some slick direction, and an undercurrent of emotional intensity that's able to dig just enough below the surface to intrigue. The story does have its holes, but it's well written overall. The subplots are given just enough depth and it keeps a swift pace. Now, I will admit the final act does go way over the top than what it needs to. It does kind of undercut the more serious and grounded film built in the first two acts. However, both Snipes and De Niro are awesome in these characters. Snipes really feels at home in a role that he played back in Major League, so he really has the athleticism of a ball player and he has the gravitas of a superstar athlete as well. And then you get De Niro, who just shines in a truly dark and demented performance. So when these two finally come to a head in the closing, it makes The Fan a satisfying ride into the dark side of sports fandom. Written and directed by Vondi Curtis Hall, this next movie centers on two drug addicts who desperately want to kick their habits, but find help seemingly impossible to find when attempting to enroll in government-assisted detox programs in Gridlocked from 1997, starring Tupac Shakur, Tim Roth, and Thandaway Newton. Many of you would assume that a film about a couple of heroin addicts attempting to go clean could end up being a depressing and slow and heavy-handed movie, but if you've seen Gridlocked, you will know what I mean when I say this movie is really able to thrive on its offbeat humor and its high-energy edginess. This movie, at the same time, is effortlessly able to bring natural humor from a couple of frustrated characters, but it's also able to explore the issues with government bureaucracies, all within an informative lens. I think Gridlocked is super gritty, but it's also unassumingly elegant at times, and I think the juxtaposition between these tones really results in an engaging film that can sweep you up and have you invested in the grounded mission of its characters. This one actually came out 4 months after the murder of Tupac, and he delivers a charged performance, as does Roth, who pumps life into this character as well, and I think he and Tupac really are perfect for the needs of this movie. It delivers action, humor, emotion, style, and knowledge, all within its very entertaining 90-minute runtime. Next up is a college comedy about a couple of failing students that discover they can get passing grades if one of their roommates kills themselves. In 1998's Dead Man on Campus, directed by Alan Cohn, starring Mark Paul Gosselaar, Tom Everett Scott, and Poppy Montgomery. I'll always have a particular fondness for this movie as it came out when I was in college, and I feel I related to the character played by Gosselaar probably a little too much, both in good and bad ways, as a guy who spent 9 years in college, 6 of which were at a 2-year school, but I can see where this movie won't be to everybody's taste, as it is a little bit more than mean-spirited. However, that's the whole entire point of the film, and for that aspect, I think this movie absolutely succeeds at being a fun, humorous, easily engaging college comedy. Sure, there are some dumb jokes and characters that don't work so well, but there are just as many dumb jokes and characters that deliver a riot of laughter. I think Gosler and Scott are a solid duo. Gosler specifically, who is just he's essentially playing Van Wilder before Reynolds. He's the spotlight of this movie. He is the driving force of the humor. There are also some clever spots of comedy woven into this pleasantly cruel plot, from strong jokes to comical situations. Dead Man on Campus throws it all at you within its short runtime, and it's still a lighthearted roller coaster of dark comedy all these years later. This next crime thriller follows an undercover cop who takes on a ruthless crime lord. He knew the risks, but not how far he would have to go in 1991's Into Deep, starring LL Cool J, Omar Epps, Nia Long, and Stanley Tucci, directed by Michael Reimer. Now, I will admit this movie doesn't necessarily bring anything new to the undercover cop thriller, and it certainly does mold itself right in there to pretty much follow the formula beat for beat, from the close calls to the character tests of moralities. You've seen this movie before. However, you wouldn't be able to tell this was a recycled story from watching the film, because In Too Deep, I think, does deliver plenty of effort. The cast certainly makes the effort to take these routine characters and make them their own. I think Epps is a solid lead. He hits the highs and lows effectively. I think Stanley Tucci is great as the handler. Nia Long makes the most of a generic role. Then front and center is LL Cool J, who just owns this character. He has his usual charisma, but the sadistic undercurrent to his performance really is what makes this movie hold up. And overall, I think this one brings really enough style, enough grit, a thin layer of emotional intensity, and plenty of violence to compensate for its creative shortcomings. Kicking things off is a comedy centered on a con man who assumes the identity of a house sitter to hide out, but runs into some comical problems when the family of the homeowners pop into town for a visit in 1990's Opportunity Knocks, starring Dana Carvey, Lou Graff, Robert Loggia, and Julia Campbell, directed by Daniel Petrie. Now, I know everybody has their varied taste in comedy, but if you enjoy dumb comedy and you like the antics of Dana Carvey during his prime, then you will find fun in this movie, as he plays a con man that seems ready for any situation. Many would say this is just a collection of comedic bits stitched together with a loosely threaded plot, and I would agree with that. However, I don't think that's a detriment to the overall entertainment value that Opportunity Knocks delivers. It's early 90s bit comedy slapped together with an 80s humorous plotline, and I think it works for delivering mindless entertainment. It's certainly juvenile at times, but I think it can connect to that teenager inside of you as Carvey works through his entire spectrum of comedy in a tightly paced film. The supporting cast is solid as well. I think Robert Loggia is a nice addition, but really Carvey is full throttle in this one, and his relentless delivery is a good time when you're in the mood for a lighthearted laugh or two. Next up is a gritty action movie about a cop accused of murder, and the only man who knows he's innocent is the killer who framed him, in Ricochet from 1991, starring Denzel Washington, John Lithgow, Ice-T, and Kevin Pollak, from director Russell Mulcahy. I really don't feel Ricochet gets mentioned enough when talking about great action flicks from the era. You get Denzel Washington, who just absolutely takes this character and elevates it to world-class levels. Then you get John Lithgow. We all know him as the cute, cuddly grandpa, or playing the office suit now, but during his early years, Lithgow could deliver a bold, vibrant villain that was just maniacal, and his turn in this one is just absolutely perfect in my opinion. I think Ricochet is just one of those early 90s action flicks that has a down and dirty 80s vibe to it, and watching Washington and Lithgow just go at it, I think is still very entertaining all these years later for an action movie. This movie creates a really foreboding tension. The score, which essentially sounds like the Predator score, just gives this movie instant nostalgia. You get Jesse the Body Ventura, plenty of bloody violence, a top tier finale that really just thrives on practical effects, and Ricochet is just one of those movies that goes way over the top in all the ways you would want. Moving along to 1992 is a sports comedy about a con man recently released from prison who makes a bet that he feels he cannot lose, in Diggstown, starring James Woods, Louis Gossett Jr., Bruce Dern, and Oliver Pratt, from director Michael Ritchie. Apparently, this was a movie that flopped at the box office, but when my friend and I caught it on late night cable as teenagers, we absolutely loved it. Admittedly, when watching it as an adult, it's a much different movie, and I would say it's a better one. I think the chemistry really shines between Gossett and Junior. They're fantastic together. Their rapport and their banter really feels natural. I think it allows a lot of the comedic beats to land with effective laughs. Now, sure, the plot here is a bit unrealistic, but I mean, who really cares? It's plenty grounded enough to just take this fun ride of humor and boxing action that Diggstown delivers. There's no denying that Woods and Gossett Jr. carry this movie, but I think Bruce Dern is a bright spot as well. And really what makes Diggstown so much fun is that it's just an easily consumable, easily engaging film. Its characters feel harmless, and really the movie overall just has kind of a great level of self-awareness to it. It's barely over 90 minutes, so it's over and done with before you know it. And I would consider this to be a movie that has really only gotten better over time. Next up is a thriller about a kid who goes out to stay with his aunt and quickly becomes friends with his little cousin, which would usually be a normality of life. The only problem here is his cousin's a little psychopath. In 1993's The Good Son, starring Macaulay Culkin and Elijah Wood, from director Joseph Rubin. Now, this movie absolutely killed it at the box office, but was not really well received by critics at all. It was surely riding on the momentum of Culkin and Home Alone, but a lot of people were just not really ready to see little Kevin McAllister in full-on psycho mode. Now, I will agree with some of the complaints that the story doesn't really ride much below the surface, and it's far from a tried and true psychological thriller, but I think after all these years that The Good Son really plays as an entertaining, soft slasher horror type movie, or at least as much as it can be as being a studio film led by a couple of kids. But overall, I think The Good Son really is just nicely acted. I think both Macaulay Culkin and Elijah Wood are strong in their characters, and the tension between them in many scenes, I think, rivals what you could get from some adult actors. And I think with its super tight pacing and its frequent acts of mayhem, that The Good Son is still entertaining, light viewing for the horror genre. Next up is a wilderness set action thriller about a family on vacation who run into a couple fugitives, which quickly turns it into the summer vacation from hell in The River Wild from 1994, starring Meryl Streep, Kevin Bacon, David Strathairn, John C. Reilly, and directed by Curtis Hanson. This movie was another of those cable TV discoveries for me, and while The River Wild doesn't break new ground in the real-time action thriller formula, I think it does thrive on many levels. It's fast-paced, it has a very few lulls, the river action is impressively shot to really pull you out into the wilderness with these characters, and I think the tension has a nice gradual elevation before the high-energy finale kicks in. Then you get the strong performances with everyone, in particular Streep and Bacon, really making the most of these recycled character types. Both of them really do, in my opinion, go all in on these performances. You can sense they enjoy the sadistic game of cat and mouse that their characters are playing, and I think it translates nicely on screen in a very naturally engaging way. And I think where this movie also really thrives is just being able to tell a suspenseful story with highs and lows and plenty of hurdles where you can easily relate to the characters, to imagine what you would do in these situations, and that's really what these movies are all about. We're stepping back into the Old West for this next movie about a gunfighter that returns to a small frontier town on the eve of a dueling tournament for revenge. And Sam Raimi's The Quick and the Dead from 1995, starring Sharon Stone, Gene Hackman, Russell Crowe, Leonardo DiCaprio, Keith David, and many more. I'll always have a soft spot for this movie for some reason, and as a kid I did watch some westerns, but they honestly never really grabbed me. However, the over-styling of The Quick and the Dead was really appealing to me as a teenager, as much as that may pain some of the purists in the genre to hear me say. However, like Young Guns, I think this movie really plays like an action flick with a very heavy, pure western vibe to it, and it's still a very strong, entertaining watch today. The ensemble cast in this movie is like 9 or 10 names deep with familiar faces and great character actors. Stone and Hackman have a raw tension between them that I think fits the tone so well, and all of the supporting cast really elevates their characters with their presence. I always felt like this was sort of a Young Guns spin-off with a splash of blood sport tossed into the plot, and I think it's a great time. The action is intense, it's nicely placed throughout the runtime, and Stone's mission, as familiar as it may be, and with this writing, I think is more than able to see the emotional core of the drama to make all the action mean something. And I think still 10 or even 20 years from now, The Quick and the Dead will still hold up as a great movie. Next up is a Mississippi set legal drama that follows a young lawyer who defends a black man that's accused of killing two white men who raped his little daughter in Joel Schumacher's A Time to Kill from 1996, starring Matthew McConaughey, Samuel L. Jackson, Sandra Bullock, Kevin Spacey, and Oliver Platt. Oh man, I remember watching this movie when it was released. I had went out on a date. I think I was maybe in my senior year. I knew the cast in this movie was all familiar. I just had no idea really what the plot was about. I had no idea how emotionally hard-hitting it was going to be. So it may not have been the best pick for a teen date night, but damn, this movie is just raw to the core. It can really reach in, grab your heart, and just squeeze it with ease. I remember fighting back tears when watching this movie on that date, and even to this day, A Time to Kill can really just hit the emotional notes with such a strong primal intensity. The writing, I think, is just extremely well structured. It has a lot of different subplots to tell and many layers that need to be woven in, and I think this script just knocks it out of the park. The performances are heartfelt and relatable. Everybody really brings their A game to this film, and with Schumacher's intimate direction of this just dirty and just evil plot, I think the fight for justice in this film will really enrage you. It will uplift you, and when the end credits roll, you will really feel the weight of what you have just watched. This next comedy sees a bratty rich teenager attempting to stage her own kidnapping, which naturally goes horribly wrong when the car that she's hiding in is stolen by a small-time thief in Marco Brambia's Excess Baggage from 1997, starring Alicia Silverstone, Benicio del Toro, and Christopher Walken. This is another of those just came and went comedies that may not work for everybody, but I think for those that enjoy a comedy that has a bit of a dark humor and a grimy atmosphere to it, then Excess Baggage will be a fun treat. I think the chemistry between Silverstone and Del Toro feels more than natural enough, so it's easy to have fun with these characters and the wild ride that this plot takes them on. I think the humor has moments of clever and witty laughs, and while I personally feel this movie should have leaned more into the comically sadistic side, it still lands plenty of laughs. I do think the script over focuses on the romantic angle, but it doesn't slow the film down too much. It's just to me that these are the moments when the film gets a little bit over light and falls into some of the formula tropes, but regardless, when looking back on it, Excess Baggage is still a lighthearted comedy with splashes of fun action and a very strong, capable sense of humor that can really sweep you up when you sit down for it. Moving along, I have a little drama that follows the lives of intertwining characters living in Los Angeles, all going through differing experiences of love and different impacts on their current day lives, in William Carroll's Playing by Heart from 1998, starring Sean Connery, Gillian Anderson, Angelina Jolie, Ryan Phillippe, Dennis Quaid, Ellen Burstyn, and many more. No, I'm not going to lie, guys. The first time I watched Playing by Heart, I was that dude sitting in his bed with a pint of ice cream and tears in his eyes. I remember I was very early in college, or maybe hadn't even started yet. I was living in my friend's dad's basement. I rented this movie from Blockbuster because I had zero weekend plans. Selection was limited. I didn't have anything else to check out, and I'm glad I didn't, because if not, I probably would have never gotten to see this movie. Now, Playing by Heart is not perfect, and when watching as an adult, it certainly does play more to the melodrama than I remembered. However, it's still a very highly compelling and a very highly engaging drama. It follows a collection of different stories that can each invest you in their own ways. The performances really give these characters a natural human quality, and getting to see how they all interconnect is intriguing to see explored. I think Playing by Heart is a movie that's really about relationships. It's about everyday grounded relationships, and with this world-class cast, each character is really in good hands, resulting in a movie that's just filled with relatable plot lines to lure you in. And next up is a highly underrated thriller about a common suburbanite who begins to suspect that his normal neighbors could be terrorists. In 1999's Arlington Road, starring Jeff Bridges, Tim Robbins, Joan Cusack, and Hope Davis, directed by Mark Pellington. I remember going to see Wild Wild West and walking out of the theater completely disappointed. We were strolling down the halls, and then I saw a poster for Arlington Road on the wall a few doors down. It was conveniently just about to start, so we figured, what the hell, let's step in and make sure these seats are in good shape and that everything sounds great. And this movie kicked ass. I really loved the tension that it built as Bridges relentlessly tries to prove his notion that there is something off with his seemingly normal neighbors. Tim Robbins is both unassuming and inviting, as well as very evil and sinister, and his performance and the turns he takes is perfect for what this movie needed. And really what I still enjoy about Arlington Road is how it just maneuvers a quick intro, then just a game of cat and mouse as Bridges gets little clues during the middle act. Then somewhere there is this point when Arlington Road just launches out of the gate like cinephiles heading to Barnes & Noble's on Criterion sale day, and it doesn't let up. Arlington Road does try to do a little too much in the closing act, but it's still highly satisfying. When the end credits roll, you will find yourself unclenching. Now, first up is a movie I would consider to be an all-time favorite of mine. Some would say this movie is lost for good reason. However, in 1990, a groundbreaking comedy would be released about a couple of surfing garbage men that stumble onto a dead body in Men at Work, written, directed by, and starring Emilio Estevez, as well as his brother Charlie Sheen and Keith David. Now, Men at Work is just one of those comedies you will either have a complete blast with or just not get into it at all. Now, if you love absolutely silly, 100% mindless humor, then this movie is a fast-paced ride of amazing nonsensical hilarity. I think Estevez and Sheen are great in the leads. Sheen is known now for comedy after his sitcom era, but at this time, he was still relatively new to the genre outside of Major League, and he knocks it out of the park with a comical performance. This central plot is stupidly humorous, and when Keith David gets thrown into the mix, this movie is just really a riot of fun comedy and action. I think David delivers a ton of his own laughs. There are even more quotable lines during this tight runtime, and I think with the just the small town beach setting, that Men at Work is a fun, laughable escape. Now, it isn't perfect. The finale doesn't quite stick the landing, but I think with all these cartoonish characters and all the absurdity being rooted in a little bit of a reality, that Men at Work is a comical ride watching as these garbage men and their observer try to figure things out while evading corrupt businessmen, a pair of relentless bike cops, and a pair of bumbling hitmen. Next up is a tense drama about an American woman who goes to visit her husband's family in Iran, only to learn that he plans to keep them there forever. In 1991's Not Without My Daughter, starring Sally Field and Alfred Molina, from director Brian Gilbert. I remember being in my early teens and my family was watching this movie. I remember coming out of my room and just seeing the whole fam in a mess of tears, and at the time I couldn't have been less interested, but later when I was in college I actually watched this movie from start to finish, and it's without question a gripping ride of dramatic highs and lows. It's a tried and true woman in peril flick. In this case, it's a mother trying to get her daughter back into the States. It's kind of an international battle of custody between not just a mother and a father, but between what feels like a mother and an entire country. I think Sally Field really is just the driving force here. She really knocks it out of the park with just a great performance that you can just easily connect with. I think Molina is convincing as well, despite his character not being thoroughly written, in my opinion. His change of personality does kind of feel more like a plot device than overall. I think the emotional current here is a bit surface level. It doesn't really dive into the cultural subtext of things, but it was the early 90s, and at the core, seeing Field fight to get her daughter back is plenty gripping enough on its own. This movie follows a couple of teens going to high school in a rough part of Chicago who also take place in underground boxing matches. Against all odds, they became friends. Against their will, they became opponents in 1992's Gladiator, starring James Marshall, Cuba Gooding Jr., and Brian Dennehy. Generally, when people are talking about movies and the name Gladiator comes up, they instinctively think of Russell Crowe. However, when you're a true blue 80s and 90s movie geek like myself, The name Gladiator instinctively makes me think of Brian Dennehy and his illegal boxing circuit stocked with high school fighters. I love the grittiness of this movie, and despite the ridiculousness of the plot, I think the overall world of this film is more than able to just pull you in, to take you on this ride of surface level emotions and procedural friendships and in the ring melodrama. Gladiator is not a perfect film, but I do think it is perfect for its needs. It's a teen movie that you can connect with, and despite nobody in this movie truly feeling like high school students, it's still kind of just easy to turn a blind eye to in order to just take the journey of these two characters and their ultimate clash with Dennehy, who absolutely brings this movie just the menacing villain that it needed. I think this movie overall is pretty well acted for the most part. I think Dennehy and Gooding Jr. are solid, and Marshall, despite being a bit too stiff, I guess he does the job too. And overall, this movie is still just a suspenseful boxing movie meets high school thriller mashup that's a great time to watch today. This action thriller centers on a group of friends heading to a boxing match that take the wrong turn and find themselves on a fight for survival. Don't move, don't whisper, don't even breathe. It's Judgment Night from 1993, starring Emilio Estevez, Cuba Gooding Jr., Dennis Leary, Stephen Dorff, and Jeremy Piven, directed by Stephen Hopkins. Now, personally, I can sit down for this movie at any time, no matter what I'm doing. I think it blends a great real-time plot that has intriguing layers of suspense and grittiness and unnerving tension to it. Then there's the blend of characters, all old friends, one a little brother with their own individual dynamics and history to themselves that all evolve over the course of this story as well. And then finally, there is the awesome performance from Dennis Leary. I really wished he would have played more seedy villains like this during his prime, but nonetheless, he does here, and he is awesome in my opinion. He's very capable, he's confident, a little bit comical, and definitely intimidating, and I really love how he handles himself in this character. And sure, Judgment Night is essentially a Die Hard-ish ride, but it's still a thrilling one filled with tons of action and suspense and close calls. These settings, I think, are perfect for the needs of the film, with this rundown city coming in as the perfect backbone for all the twists and turns that this story and its adventure takes. Now, you can't talk about Judgment Night also without talking about the world-class soundtrack that just blended rap with hard rock, resulting in really, I think, the perfect soundtrack for this plot. And this movie is just one that, despite its formulaic approach, can still just easily sweep you up and have you in the middle of the action on this terrifying night. Admittedly, this movie isn't necessarily lost, but it certainly is undermentioned, as it follows a pair of psychopathic lovers who embark on a road trip of murder and media glorification in Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers from 1994, starring Woody Harrelson, Juliette Lewis, and Robert Downey Jr. This movie was far ahead of its time. It delivered a completely visceral experience. It's one of those movies you will kind of pull something new from it each time that you watch. When I was watching it as a young teen, it was just a completely sadistic ride of visual carnage, and with its odd camera angles and coloring changes and everything else that this movie throws at you visually. And then later in high school, I was able to kind of dive more into the concepts of the media exploitation and the just the commercialization of violence. I was able to kind of truly appreciate the performances from Harrelson and Lewis as well, who are just, I think, perfect as this Bonnie and Clyde-esque couple that become a media sensation. I think Natural Born Killers is just an ambitious movie, from storytelling, from the filmmaking aspect to the themes that it's exploring. I think it's just actually aged much better over time, and I think even if you've seen this movie, you will be pulled into its demented ride. And all these years later, it's kind of awesome to see both Lewis and Harrelson, much younger in their careers, going all in on these performances to make this twisted tale a timeless one. This gritty crime thriller is set in the 60s. It follows a Vietnam vet dealing with social and civil rights issues back at home that sees an opportunity to create a better life for he and his family, and potentially destroy it at the same time. In 1995's Dead Presidents, directed by the Hughes brothers, starring Lorenz Tate, Keith David, Chris Tucker, and a solid supporting cast. To me, Dead Presidents delivers a very gritty, decade-spanning exploration of the costs of war, not just in terms of service, but more so just the lasting impacts that it can have on a veteran's life. Here, an African-American veteran who, after his service in Vietnam, finds his dreams of life shattered in the just harsh realities of what is considered post-war America. Dead Presidents is lined with emotional and dramatic intensity, and it's all complemented with, in my opinion, incredible cinematography and direction. I think this movie has a strong atmosphere to it. It kind of feels like you're stepping back in time when watching this movie, and I think it's also extremely well acted. Lorenz Tate is certainly the lead, but the ensemble cast here is able to bring a lot of life and energy and, most important, screen presence to bolster these characters. This is a film that also delivers the suspense of a heist when the story takes a darker turn. I think the main hindrance in Dead Presidents is that it maybe tries to accomplish too much. Some of the characters, some of the motives, and a few of the turns do feel a bit contrived, but it's nothing that gets in the way of the impact that this movie can deliver. This suspenseful film is set in the late 1800s, and it follows a bridge builder and a legendary hunter who attempt to fend off lions attacking workers in Stephen Hopkins' The Ghost in the Darkness from 1996, starring Val Kilmer, Michael Douglas, and Tom Wilkinson, as well as a group of vicious lions. This movie actually received mixed reviews upon its release, and I think it's because it falls into a trap that a certain film like this often can, that being that its foundation is a bit too similar to something often relegated as being a prestige film, that being a lofty time period setting, a pair of flashy A-list actors in the lead, the backdrops of the African landscapes, and the dire importance of needing to build a bridge to connect civilizations. But Robert Redford and Meryl Streep are not in this movie, and really all The Ghost in the Darkness is an action thriller with savage lions as the villains. This is much more Black Rain than it is Dancing with Wolves, and it's an entertaining escape. Michael Douglas is so much fun in this movie. He's soaking it up as this legendary hunter with his moments of just unintentional comedy. Val Kilmer is delivering a performance that would tell you he actually thought it was a prestige film, and they do have a somewhat tense chemistry together, which I actually do think works well for the needs of this plot. I think the production design is great. It has a natural visual appeal to it. The tension also elevates nicely as the violence of the carnage increases with each lion attack. And sure, it's not perfect and there are some modest pacing issues, but overall the tease of these lions lurking around these characters at all times isn't necessarily Jaws, but it is fun, guilty pleasure suspense. Coming up next is a gripping mystery about a man who searches for his wife when she goes missing after their car breaks down in the desert. It's a movie that claimed it could happen to you, and that movie is 1997's Breakdown, starring Kurt Russell, J.T. Walsh, M.C. Gainley, and Kathleen Quinlan. Over the course of his career, Kurt Russell has played some big, bold characters with inflated personalities, but some of his best films are his simpler ones, and that's exactly what Breakdown is. It's a movie that doesn't try to get too clever. It doesn't try to work in too many twists and turns. It's about a normal couple on a road trip, and when the wife goes missing, the layers of the mystery begin to peel back in a very grounded and just eerily normal way. What makes this movie so intense and so unnerving is that it feels like these situations could happen to anybody at any time. I think Kurt Russell is great in the lead as this normal husband, just this pushed to the edge. You can easily sympathize with his helplessness. You can easily invest in his determination to find his wife. The supporting cast is awesome as well. Everybody's a bit creepy, but not forced creepy. Again, nothing here is overdone. I think all of these characters in this movie feel like real people that you've actually crossed paths with in your own life. And just the authentic atmosphere created in Breakdown just results in waves of tension with a well-crafted mystery that will easily have you locked in throughout the duration. Next up is a high-energy crime drama about a couple of young criminals making a life on armed robberies who both have dreams of getting out of the life, but instead find the walls closing in on them in Belly from 1998, directed by Hype Williams, starring hip-hop legends Nas, DMX, and T-Boz, as well as Tyron Turner and Terrell Hicks. No, I can understand where some would relegate Belly as being a case of style over substance. However, I would contend the opposite. Yes, the plot is a bit overly jumbled. It does lack a smooth procedural flow, and yes, placement of a stylistic montage is a focus over continuity of the storytelling, yet there's just something kind of cool and interesting about this movie that makes the raw performances and fragmented storytelling a surprisingly intriguing ride. Some could argue aren't really any likable characters here, and there's no denying the glorification of violence, but music video man Hype Williams delivers what you would expect, a full feature film that very much plays like a music video in long stretches. The dialogue is a bit self-righteous at times, but the edginess and the grittiness of this movie just makes it feel more like a real-life exploration of street crime and the just repercussions of one's actions. The music, as you would expect, is perfectly curated. It's the lifeblood of this movie's energy, and sure, there are better films in this genre, but I think Belly has many more positives than it does negatives to make it worth a watch. This crime caper is a solid remake that follows a rich playboy who steals art for amusement, but ultimately finds his match in a young, seductive detective in John McTiernan's The Thomas Crown Affair from 1999, starring Pierce Brosnan, Rene Russo, and Dennis Leary. I've only seen the original Thomas Crown Affair once many years ago, but I do think this remake, regardless of its comparisons to the original, is a fantastic film. First, you get the perfectly layered and structured plot that just lays out a devilishly entertaining caper. Then you get the perfectly sized supporting cast, and then front and center is the seductively charged performances from Brosnan and Russo. I remember watching this movie countless times as a teen. Rene Russo was and always will be my Mrs. Robinson, and shit, even today at 70, I'd still take her out on a romantic weekend to La Jolla if my wife wouldn't be filing divorce papers at the same time. I think she's awesome in this movie with a perfect blend of toughness and vulnerability. Then you get Pierce Brosnan, who's just soaking in the scenery here. He's essentially Bond without the Walther PPK. He's smooth, he's charming, he's cunning. He and Russo are just dynamite together. The Thomas Crown Affair just feels sleek. It feels worthy of the lavish lifestyle of its main character, and the rewatch value because of this movie's cinematic elegance is timeless in my opinion. This comedy centers around an uptight by-the-book FBI agent that must take a charming mobster into witness protection out in the suburbs in the hilarious My Blue Heaven from 1990, starring Steve Martin and Rick Moranis, from director Herbert Ross, written by Nora Ephron. Much like Goodfellas, released only a month after this movie, My Blue Heaven was also based on the life of Henry Hill, but obviously with a full-throttle comedic tone through Martin's portrayal of Vinnie Antonelli. Sure, My Blue Heaven follows the typical tropes of the odd couple, fish-out-of-the-water genre, but in the hands of Steve Martin and Rick Moranis, the result is comedic gold. I think Martin is riding at full speed in this exaggerated mafioso character type. He's just pumping out laughs from his dialogue delivery to his absurd accent and his just comical physical mannerisms. Martin knows exactly what this movie needed, and he knocks it out of the park with his performance, much like Rick Moranis does, who takes that typical straight character to Martin's over-the-top one and really does make the role his own. He is able to leave his comedic imprint on this movie. My Blue Heaven, to me, is like a silly, feel-good comedy, and I think it checks all the boxes, from effective jokes to comical scenarios, just enough action, just enough heart, and a fantastic chemistry between Martin and Moranis. And this movie is ridiculous in all the ways you would want one to be. This little action comedy is a favorite of mine. It stars Michael J. Fox as an action star researching for a role by following around a hot-tempered detective who just so happens to be on the trail of a serial killer in 1991's The Hard Way, directed by John Badham, also starring LL Cool J, Stephen Lang, and Annabella Sciorra. Now, to me, films like The Hard Way are examples of what popcorn movies used to be like before the days of superhero flicks and big over-the-top CGI-filled adventures that we get now. The Hard Way, to me, is like an old-school textbook Hollywood film carried by the charisma and chemistry of its two leading stars, a creative concept, an effective sense of humor, touches of heart here and there, and heavy doses of exciting action. This movie delivers all of it, and all of these years later, watching Fox follow the ultra grumpy Woods around in this movie is entertaining. The supporting cast is solid. The main villain is filled with a lot of sadistic cartoonishness through the performance of Stephen Lang, and this movie just gels overall. I think the soundtrack is great. The practical stunt work is able to elevate the action set pieces, and while it may have its familiar character types and recycled plot beats, The Hard Way is an action comedy that delivers awesome action and hilarious comedy. I think Fox and Woods are so good together here. They're kind of an unlikely pair, but when they're playing off each other in this movie, the result is perfect, and The Hard Way goes out with a satisfying level of spectacle, making this movie a total cinematic package. Next up is another comedy. Most people remember Kid and Play from the House Party movies, but they also delivered another teen comedy about two students, one a delinquent and the other a valedictorian, who have their high school records swapped, resulting in waves of humor in 1992's Class Act, starring Christopher Reed and Christopher Martin, also known as Kid and Play, directed by Randall Miller. Much like Christopher Nolan's Inception was a dream inside of a dream, Class Act is a character swap movie inside of a character swap movie. Kid is Play, Play is Kid. Both of their lives are conveniently and absurdly swapped in this admittedly silly comedy that, without question, does ride on the energy and the chemistry of its two leads. Class Act is just a kind of a dumb high school comedy that tries to navigate this ridiculous premise, and while doing so, it's a lighthearted movie that will have you cackling throughout if you can dial your serious button down for about 90 minutes. If you can do that, then you will have a blast with this silly movie as Kid and Play navigate their swapped lives in high school. Now, Class Act doesn't reel you in with a captivating premise. In fact, it essentially plays out like a long high school video with a series of vignettes cut into it, and it's just kind of a charming piece of cinema's past. Play is solid in this one. He doesn't really feel like the tough guy that he's trying to portray, yet he has his moments. Kid, however, is the driving force to me. From his antics, his mannerisms, and his delivery, he's just hilarious, and overall the cartoonish adventures in Class Act are as well. Now, I really do think this action movie has been forgotten. It centers on a DEA-employed bounty hunter and the brother of a thief who reluctantly team up together to look for a hoard of cash stolen from a drug dealer in 1994's Gunman, starring Christopher Lambert, Mario Van Peebles, Dennis Leary, Sally Kirkland, and Patrick Stewart, directed by Darren Sarafi. Released in some countries in 94 and others in 93 and maybe a couple countries in 95, this movie kind of got a staggered release, and it's not a film without its flaws. The plot is a bit messy. It also relies heavily on almost every major trope in the action genre. However, I think if you enjoy B action movies and seeing older films with a familiar cast, then there is plenty of entertainment to be found in this just loud, brash action romp. I remember reading a review where someone compared Gunman to being the good, the bad, and the ugly meets Romancing the Stone, and I would really agree with that. This movie goes from feeling like a cheesy spaghetti western to an 80s grindhouse action flick to an over-the-top adventure film, and while it may not always work, the odd pairing of Lambert and Peebles with Dennis Leary as the heavy, I think brings more than enough charm and energy and edginess to this movie. Sure, this one is just kind of going through the motions, but I think seeing this familiar cast in earlier roles such as Dennis Leary and Patrick Stewart and even Sally Kirkland is kind of cool, and somehow, despite being a cash hunt down in South America, the movie manages to stitch in some rap performances to kind of cement the film's high energy soundtrack. So if you like movies that kind of throw everything at the wall to see what sticks and tops it off with a bunch of macho humor, then Gunman is a winner. For some reason, this was a movie I watched a lot when I was in high school. It follows a failing businessman who is hired by the Army to teach underachieving recruits to help them pass basic training. It was one man's mission to teach a few the proud and the impossible in Renaissance Man from 1994, starring Danny DeVito, Gregory Hines, and directed by Penny Marshall. Roger Ebert likened this movie to a cross between Dead Poets Society and Private Benjamin, minus the spirit of both of those films, and to a point I would agree. Renaissance Man does feel overly manufactured, as do some of the character arcs feel a bit kind of artificial, and who knows how teaching Shakespeare to cadets is going to help them in the Army, but I don't care. DeVito and Hines are a great pairing as they go from enemies to compadres. Now, my main issue with this movie really is just the length. At over 2 hours long, they could have easily shaved 30 minutes off of this thing, yet I still enjoy it for some reason. I remember watching this one a lot on cable as a teen. It's just a effective, feel-good comedy that doesn't require any thought at all. DeVito is able to land solid laughs, then seamlessly steps into the drama territory to kind of tug on the heartstrings a little, to land that superficial sentimentality that many comedies from this time period enjoyed. I think Hines is great as well. He's just kind of just as perplexed as to DeVito's presence in this movie and on base as pretty much everybody watching. And I mean, seeing them maneuver these routine plot points is just kind of enjoyable and nostalgic. It's one of those ones where everybody learns about themselves to be better people at the end of the movie than when it started. And sometimes that surface level sweetness is all you want in a movie. This moody thriller from 1995 follows a brilliant lawyer who is called to the case of a young man about to be condemned to death for the death of a child. Buried deep in the Florida Everglades is a secret that can save an innocent man or let a killer kill again in Just Cause from 1995, starring Sean Connery, Lawrence Fishburne, and Blair Underwood. Now, to me, Just Cause is really a tale of two movies. Mid-90s Hollywood loved legal dramas, and for the first half, this movie delivers just that. It's also a touch of a character study as you learn more about the characters from Connery and Fishburne, while also building your own case and your own evidence to whether Underwood's character is guilty or not. The settings down in the South, I think, gives the story a moody, foreboding backdrop, and the performances are excellent across the board. Connery is, of course, smooth and wise. He's kind of always classy despite the seediness lurking all around him. Then there's Fishburne, who's just sadistic as this cop. He's ultra grimy in this movie, and it's just perfect for what the role needed. So adding all this to an already compelling mystery and the ever charming Blair Underwood, the first half of Just Cause to me is surprisingly engulfing. Now, where some people may have issues is definitely going to be on the back end when admittedly Just Cause tries to do way too much. This is when unneeded twists and turns come in to convolute things. The shift in tone is noticeable. It's not a deal breaker, but it certainly is something that hinders the emotional intensity that the first half built. It also tries to close out with the traditional studio showdown gusto, but still I think this movie is great when you want something that's gripping but not overly impactful. Next up is a hilarious sports comedy. It's set in the world of boxing where the rules are simple. If you can't find the perfect contender, you create one. In 1996's The Great White Hype, directed by Reginald Hudlin, starring Samuel L. Jackson, Damon Wayans, Jeff Goldblum, Peter Berg, and many other familiar faces. I've always loved this movie. The Great White Hype is a satire on professional boxing, and at least during the time, and it still delivers a riot of laughs today. The cast is impressive. Everybody gets their moments to shine comedically, and Hudlin's direction is awesome as he captures kind of all the key elements of pro boxing and just exaggerates them to comical results. I think Wayans is hilarious as the champ who gets out of shape when he learns who his next opponent is. Samuel L. Jackson is just brilliantly wild as a cross between like a Don King and that old wrestling manager, the Grand Wizard. I think he, like Wayans, is just riding at full comedic speed in this movie. Everybody really knows what this movie wanted to be, and I think all the characters work. Even Peter Berg, whose bumbling dude bro persona is kind of perfect for this character that takes the boxing world by storm. So, with a great cast of amusing, cartoonish characters, a strong sense of humor in the writing, a great high energy soundtrack, and all the flamboyance of pro boxing, The Great White Hype is an amusement ride of silly humor that still holds up today. Next up is a cop thriller that has a seedy, sort of grimy tone to it. It centers on two corrupt cops who accidentally murder an undercover DEA agent. Whoops, and then they find their lives spiraling out of control as they attempt to cover it up. And Jim Koof's Gang Related from 1997, starring Jim Belushi, Tupac Shakur, and Layla Rakan. I've always loved gritty cop thrillers, and something about this movie always appealed to me. I wasn't able to put my finger on it as a teenager, but later in life I realized what I loved about Gang Related was its uniqueness. There are no good guys in this movie. The main characters are the villains, and that twist on this plot is really refreshing. Despite Belushi and Shakur being dirty, corrupt criminal cops, there's something about them you can kind of identify with, potentially that makes this downward spiral a little bit more intriguing, or potentially the identifying quality of this movie is it's a cautionary tale on a morality gone wrong. I don't know. Either way, the concepts of this movie work for me. It works for the film. Belushi and Shakur are both grounded. They deliver authentic, sincere performances. As the story evolves, their crimes kind of mount to cover their earlier crimes, and even seeing the differing ethical limits between them as partners is compelling to see play out. Now, my main issue with this movie is that it doesn't quite stick the landing. I feel like this is when the intensity from the filmmakers kind of draws back a bit, when the film leading up to the final act didn't. Yet all of these years later, you can still kind of easily sit back and find yourself consumed by the unnerving stress of this plot. This little dark comedy had a simple tagline: never trust a girl by her address, and that girl is teenage Vivian, living with her broke nomadic family on the outskirts of Beverly Hills during the late 70s so that they can attend the city's schools. In 1998's Slums of Beverly Hills, starring Natasha Lyonne, Alan Arkin, and Marissa Tomei, written and directed by Tamara Jenkins. This little indie movie made the festival rounds when it was released, and it did get some great reviews. I remember catching it on cable a couple years after it was released, and it really drew me in. I was living in Seattle at the time. I was a couple years away, maybe a year away from moving down to Southern California, and I just really connected to this main character's journey of trying to fit in new surroundings with people she didn't really know and wasn't used to. This movie really does deliver it all from that aspect. It's kind of heartwarming, it's humorous, it's grounded. It just kind of feels like a peek inside the lives of this dysfunctional family during the 70s just outside of Beverly Hills, which is a huge difference. I work up and through LA every month. I'm in and around Beverly Hills every month. You can go from one block being just an immaculate mansion to crossing the intersection to having just a dilapidated apartment building that hasn't been renovated since the 60s. So watching Vivian navigate this social and these class walls during the 70s is a thought-provoking and spirited ride. The production design is fantastic. This movie really does feel like a step back in time, and the performances are all perfect for the needs of their roles. I think Natasha Lyonne is fantastic. She's such an underrated performance here. She's able to hit all the emotional beats of her character and her coming of age, and Alan Arkin as her father is a home run. Slums of Beverly Hills doesn't hit you over the head with its melodrama, and I think that's what gives it a timeless appeal. Next up is a sci-fi thriller about a computer agent who is killed and his friend who gets wrapped up in it when he begins to suspect his newly launched virtual reality system could be involved. In 1999's The 13th Floor, directed by Joseph Rusnik, starring Craig Bierko, Gretchen Mol, and Vincent D'Onofrio. Now, this has always been an interesting movie to me. I didn't really understand it when I watched it as a teenager and found it to be a little bit too confusing, but I enjoyed a bulk of this film in certain sections from a visual aspect and from a storytelling aspect. There are a lot of great scenes and cool sequences in this futuristic thriller, and while the writing may not be able to fully connect them, and despite honestly sort of still finding this movie a bit convoluted, there's just something about it that I dig. I love the foreboding atmosphere and the hyper reality that this movie creates and kind of lives in. The visuals are awesome. The color spectrums really do pop from vibrant to cold and bleak, and the production design is top notch. I also like the performances in this movie. I feel that it's just one of those movies you can kind of pull something new from every time you watch it. So where the writing may have some issues in cohesiveness, I think you can't help but appreciate this film's creative ambition. The 13th Floor was a movie that took audiences to places they rarely had been to, and instead of just over-the-top spectacle, this movie kept it dark, kept it grounded, kept it unnerving. It really feels like a late 90s cyber thriller with the labs filled with colorful nightclub-like lights, and overall, I think this movie was just kind of ahead of its time. Kicking things off with comedy, this one follows three thieves that pull off a bank heist in New York City, only to find it impossible to get out of town in Quick Change from 1990, starring Gina Davis, Randy Quaid, and Bill Murray, who co-directed this one alongside Howard Franklin. This is a movie I have enjoyed since I was a teenager. I think it's hilarious, and I love the trio of Murray, Davis, and Quaid. I think each is able to bring their own comedic personality to this plot, and with the fast-moving pace, the result to me is just an effortlessly engaging film. The first half essentially plays out like a comical heist movie, then the second half is an even more amusing escape adventure on the streets of New York, and I think the pairing of these two themes is fantastic. There's a surprising amount of cleverness to the heist that makes it interesting. Then when this story hits the streets of New York, everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and this is when the humor really ramps up and when the chemistry between the cast really shines. I also like the supporting cast here. You get Jason Robards delivering a charming performance as he relentlessly tries to catch these thieves. Then you get Tony Shalhoub and Phil Hartman and Stanley Tucci and Kurtwood Smith, all in smaller roles. And really, Quick Change, while not groundbreaking, is a high-energy comedy with a dialed-in sense of humor. There's just enough range in the characters as the roadblocks mount and the frustration rises. And overall, this is just a fun, feel-good flick. Next up is a gripping drama about a rebellious army private put into a work camp stockade where he discovers the value of friendship and crosses paths with a commander battling his own demons in Cadence from 1991, starring Charlie Sheen, Lawrence Fishburne, and Martin Sheen, who also directed. Now, I will admit this movie isn't as emotionally complex as I thought it was when I was a teenager, but I still do think it's a great military drama to this day, and it's still a bit unique for the genre. Gary Busey was originally cast in the lead, but after some erratic behavior on set, Martin Sheen, who was the director, stepped in to play this role opposite his son, and I really do think it was a blessing for this movie. You have Charlie's character tossed into the stockade after punching an MP in a drunken rage after losing his father. Then you have Martin's character just battling his own demons while also being a racist alcoholic. So there is so much emotional intensity to pull from these dynamics, and I think together the Sheens really knock it out of the park. And then you get other great performances from Larry Fishburne, who is the leader of the group. Younger Sheen gets thrown into the stockade with, and he kind of has to fit in with everybody. And Cadence isn't melodramatic, it's simply dramatic. It explores the areas of the military genre that we haven't really seen very often. It delivers great music, well-rounded performance, and a skillful blending of drama and humor that turned what could easily have been a heavy-handed film to make it much more accessible. Sticking with the drama, this one centers on four inner-city teenagers who all in their own way get caught up in the pursuit of power and respect, known as Juice from 1992, starring Omar Epps, Tupac Shakur, Khalil Kain, and Jermaine Hopkins, directed by Ernest R. Dickerson. Where Juice really thrives is just as being a gripping drama with its realistic depiction of growing up in tough neighborhoods where violence is supreme, and for a teen, everything seems to be working against you. This movie is really unrelenting with its messages on police violence and social injustices and friendship dynamics and how the battle for self-control over a person's surroundings can consume you in all the wrong ways, and it's quite riveting. The performances are all great, not perfect, which I actually do think works in this story's favor. The young cast really does feel like the characters they are portraying, and it gives the plot such a grounded realism. I think the music also really just fuels the energy of the story, and watching Shakur's bishop descend into the darkness is surprisingly eerie. I remember watching this movie in the theater as a kid and just thought the sadistic fire in Shakur's performance was perfect. This story is about a group of friends all trying to prove to each other and themselves that they have control and respect, and it goes sideways in all the ways you would expect, resulting in a great film that feels like a peek in on everyday life more than it feels like a studio movie. We're stepping into the action genre for this next film about a former Special Forces soldier who returns to his high school only to find it overrun by violence and drug dealing in 1993's Only the Strong from director Sheldon Lettich, starring Mark Dacascos, Jeffrey Lewis, and Stacey Travis. Now, this action flick certainly follows many tropes in the genre, and it didn't fare too well at the box office or with critics. However, I've always enjoyed this movie. I think the tried and true plot and the elementary level emotional undercurrent that lines it works perfectly despite the predictability. I do think there's more than enough charm and appeal, specifically from the performance of Dacascos. It's kind of nostalgic to go back and look at his leading studio action flick as he kicks ass in the action department. There may be an over-reliance on slow motion, even for the time period, but fight choreography in this movie is surprisingly intricate. Only the Strong does have a lot of action working in its favor, and it's, to me, more than able to compensate for some of the recycled story themes and the cheesy drama. I think sitting down for Only the Strong today is like taking a ride back into the days when 80s action was fusing with all the new styles of the 90s, and it's quite enjoyable. I think Dacascos is a bit on the nose with his performance, and this movie may feel clunky at times. However, Only the Strong is a product of its time that kind of plays better now on nostalgia than it did back when it was released. Sticking with the action genre, this one blends sci-fi with it when a soldier convicted of murder is sent to a remote prison island where convicts are divided into factions. In Martin Campbell's No Escape from 1994, starring Ray Liotta, Lance Henriksen, Stuart Wilson, and Ernie Hudson. This is a movie that has always been near and dear to me. It kind of feels like a 80s action movie blended with Lord of the Flies, blended with 90s sci-fi, and it just all gels into a fast-moving, action-packed film that can still entertain on a rewatch. I really do think it's awesome to see Ray Liotta as the leading man. He's always been brilliant as the bad guy, but here he really carries that action star persona on his shoulders with ease. No Escape also has a great supporting cast with Lance Henriksen and Ernie Hudson and Kevin Dillon, with Stuart Wilson coming in to just drop a world-class villain into the mix to get the story wheels turning. And all of this just makes for a fun movie, and with all the production design and set design being so fantastic and just creative and detailed wardrobes, the visual appeal in No Escape still holds up great. And really, to me, this is a perfect movie to sit back for if you want to escape to another time and place with its own rules and its own potential for violence. This is when No Escape is a great time. This movie just really has just everything going in its favor. The cast really put in all the effort to bring this world to life. Sure, they're all kind of having to elevate the thin writing of their characters, but they make it work. And when the action ramps up and the battle of control rages in this movie, No Escape is a blast. This true crime drama came out in 1995. It tells the story of a young high school basketball prospect that finds his dreams threatened when he spirals into the dark world of heavy drug use in Basketball Diaries, directed by Scott Calvert, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Lorraine Bracco, and Mark Wahlberg. There has been a good amount of controversy surrounding this movie for years. It's out of print, it's not available on streaming or for online rental, and I think it's primarily due to the fact there's been a lot of lawsuits filed against the studio for this film's connections to some real-life tragic school shootings. There's a sequence in this film where DiCaprio's character has this dream sequence about just that, and yes, I will admit this is a very dark and hard-hitting film. It's about the life of Jim Carroll, a high school kid that had a bright future who fell into heroin addiction. Now, these emotionally searing and hard-hitting films were frequent in the late 90s, and to me, Basketball Diaries is one of the good ones. I think it's very well acted. I think the drama hits hard in the hands of DiCaprio. I think Wahlberg is strong in a supporting role as well. I think this movie does hold up great, but I do think the style of director Scott Calvert was a bit too indulgent. He frames up many great shots to just effectively capture the despair and the euphoria of drug use. However, he really dials up the stylistic veneer a bit too much. It's kind of hard to tell if this is a cautionary tale of a bright life consumed by drugs, or if it's trying to be an artistic puff piece that dabbles in emotions for the sake of glamorizing addiction. Clearly, he isn't doing the latter, but that tinge of uncertainty was disappointing to some, but it's not a deal breaker when you want to sit back for a gritty mid-90s drama. Next up is a supernatural horror comedy about a guy who discovers he can communicate with the dead after his wife dies in a car accident in The Frighteners from 1996, directed by Peter Jackson, starring Michael J. Fox, Trini Alvarado, Shai McBride, Dee Wallace, John Astin, and more. To me, The Frighteners is another interesting film. It made a little bit of profit at the box office. The critics, for the most part, did enjoy it, but this movie never really got the attention it deserved. It's possible the juxtaposition of the tones wasn't to everybody's taste. This movie does have a playfully haunting tone to it, and it does hold that for the most part, but it does get a bit grim and a bit dark in places, and some people may not have liked that. However, I do think with the passing of time, though, that this movie really thrives on its bizarre energy and its lighthearted mean streak that it has to it. The plot feels fresh and it works for humor very well despite being horror themed. The performances are all fantastic, specifically from Michael J. Fox, who was so much fun in this role. He never really got the recognition he deserved for the variety of the roles he took on and his range as an actor. Regardless, though, he carries the humor and the energy and the fun of this movie so effectively. The special effects are solid. They are dated, but they still play for nostalgia very well. However, the makeup work still looks great all these years later with all these just wildly just dead characters that come back to life to help a guy make some money. And with Peter Jackson's skilled direction, The Frighteners should be an annual Halloween viewing for you. Moving along is a dark and seedy crime drama about a man that sets out for revenge when his brother is killed by his partner after a heist. In 1997, City of Industry, starring Harvey Keitel, Timothy Hutton, Stephen Dorff, and Famke Janssen, directed by John Irvin. I've always thought this was a well-rounded action crime thriller, but for some reason it never really took off either. It had mixed to positive reviews, but it came and went at the theater with barely a ping on the needle. It's possible this movie came out about 5 years too late. However, it's still a moody and methodical movie that just lives in the world of crime where there aren't really any good guys. Everybody's really up to no good in this seedy little story, and that's really what I like about it. This movie relies on bravado as Keitel hunts the killer of his brother, and that's really all this movie needs. It's filled with tension, splashes of action, and with Los Angeles as the backdrop, there's just a West Coast vibe to this movie that just kicks ass. To me, City of Industry is like one of those down and dirty movies that's just built on man code and it just oozes from the performances. This movie has a great ensemble cast with names like Keitel and Dorff and Hutton and Famke Janssen, with smaller performances from Lucy Liu and Michael Jai White and Elliot Gould that really filled this film with some grounded characters. And sure, this movie may not have the gusto of others in the genre during the time, but if you want a gritty thriller that lives in the underworld, then City of Industry is a winner. Coming up next is a comedy crime story about a love triangle that goes as wrong as one possibly could in this little indie flick from 1998 called Clay Pigeons from David Dobkin, starring a great trio consisting of Joaquin Phoenix, Janine Garofalo, and Vince Vaughn. Personally, I love movies like Clay Pigeons for a couple of reasons. First, I love watching movies with familiar actors in their early days, and in this one, you get Vaughn and Phoenix and Garofalo, who are all fantastic in these quirky performances. Second, I love watching these movies that feel like they're living in a grounded and just common reality, but when you start to pay attention, everybody and everything seems just slightly off. I think this is what really allows the dark humor of Clay Pigeons to shine. Everything in this movie just feels embellished, but not overly exaggerated, and it's a great time. The story keeps a quick pace with just enough subplotting and a nice tight cast of characters that all add their own flavor to the amusement of this twisted tale. I think Vaughn is just high energy and riding at full speed. He's a total schmuck, and I love it. Phoenix is well-rounded and charismatic, and Garofalo and her dry persona just complements them well. Clay Pigeons is one of those movies you never really know where it will go next, and I think that unpredictability is awesome. This movie didn't have a huge budget. It relied on the story and the characters and the atmosphere, and it results in a movie that can easily entertain you more than 20 years after its release. Next up is a moody psychological thriller about a deeply burnt out Manhattan paramedic that is haunted by the people he has failed to save over his career, and Martin Scorsese's undermentioned Bringing Out the Dead from 1999, starring Nicolas Cage, John Goodman, Patricia Arquette, and Ving Rhames. Bringing Out the Dead is another interesting case study. It was well received by audiences and critics, yet it was a big financial failure, and I certainly think it's due to the fact that mainstream audiences probably didn't know what to do with this haunting, gritty, and just really darkly intimate film. I've been a Scorsese fan since I was a teen, and I loved how he went in a completely different direction with this movie. However, I can certainly say that I drew more from it when I watched it again later in my life in college. This is where the subtext of the movie and the subsequent brilliance in Cage's performance really shines. He just looks absolutely gutted emotionally and physically in this role. I think he delivers one of his best performances. Plus, this movie also has a great supporting cast like all Scorsese films do. Everybody delivers great performances. I love just the comedic energy from Rames's character. I love the chemistry between Cage and Arquette. It has that chance innocence to it that just adds a sincere appeal to their meeting. The scoring and the music are perfect for this dark story, and Scorsese's direction, added with the cinematography, gives Bringing Out the Dead a sinister but inviting atmosphere that I think makes this movie timeless. His comedy is about a private detective. To his clients, he's the world's best rock and roll detective, and to everybody else, he's just a dick. That man is Andrew Dice Clay, and the movie is The Adventures of Ford Fairlane from 1990, directed by Rennie Harlan, also starring Lauren Holly, Priscilla Presley, Ed O'Neill, Robert Englund, David Patrick Kelly, and a bunch of other familiar faces. Now, this is definitely a movie that will not be to everybody's taste. If you are not a fan of Andrew Dice Clay's brutish delivery of humor, then you may not enjoy this movie. If you like your comedy with an intelligent wittiness, then you may want to pass on this one as well. However, if you like dumb, silly, and blunt humor, then The Adventures of Ford Fairlane will provide you with just a barrage of absurdity and nostalgia to those movies that were built around a hot commodity at the time. Stand-up comedians traditionally get a leading role in a dumb comedy at some point during their peak, and this one is no different. Not everything in this movie works, but like a true stand-up routine, this one throws waves of comedy at you, and with everything being set inside the world of the rock and roll industry, there is no shortage of gusto. Dice Clay's fine. He's being himself. He's humorous, and I think the supporting cast is great. They all knew what the mission was. They all brought their own dashes of comedy to this just roller coaster ride of cinematic silliness. This next teenage die-hard knockoff is a movie I've talked about many times on this channel. Terrorists have taken over the Regis Academy, and they are about to learn a lesson they won't forget. In a movie some of you may know as Boy Soldiers, but it will always be Toy Soldiers to me, from 1991, starring Sean Astin, Will Wheaton, Keith Coogan, and Andrew Divoff, as well as Louis Gossett Jr. If you are at all familiar with this channel and myself, you will know that I always kind of sneak a reason in there to talk about this movie, and I would certainly class Toy Soldiers as a lost gem from the 90s. It's a pure die-hard knockoff, as I said, for teenagers. It's set at a private school, and it's just a blast. But this movie, I think, definitely has its own heart with the bond between these kids and their friendships. Sure, you need to dial down your suspension of disbelief to take this plot seriously, but I will admit there is a cleverness to how this terrorist plot is foiled that makes it just believable enough to have a great time with as a 90s action flick with a pure 80s vibe to it. The pace is swift. The core group of kids all deliver just strong, natural performances, and Louis Gossett Jr. shines in a role that really just grounds this entire movie. Toy Soldiers delivers mild doses of humor, timely doses of suspense, and plenty of exciting action. Then when the final act kicks in and all hell breaks loose, Toy Soldiers ends with the nostalgic, sentimental ending that just defined this era of the teenage action flick. This slick crime thriller claimed there was a thin line between catching a criminal and becoming one, and Lawrence Fishburne walks that line in 1992's Deep Cover from director Bill Duke, also starring Jeff Goldblum, Renee Assa, Victoria Dillard, Clarence Williams III, and Gregory Sierra. This is another movie I frequently talk about on this channel. I do think Deep Cover is a bit forgotten in the genre of crime dramas. It's not mentioned as much as it should be. This movie is just soaked with style and edginess. The soundtrack is awesome. It just serves as the pulse of the entire film, and the performances from Fishburne and Goldblum are fantastic. Fishburne delivers just a layered performance as a man with his own demons that just gets way too deep into the drug game, to the point he's connecting more with being a criminal than he is being a cop. Then you get Goldblum, who's impressive as this very uptight businessman that's just pushed to the edge, who actually finds his control when he steps into the unhinged. I love these two characters. I love these performances together. I think the supporting cast is fantastic as well. And to me, Deep Cover is just one of those movies that feels lived in. It's a bit seductive with its exploration of the criminal underworld, and when the violence hits, it really does mean something. It has ramification, and it makes this movie impactful even on a rewatch. Sticking with that theme of organized crime, this next dramatic thriller centers on a high-profile drug dealer that wants to get out of the game and knows he's going to have to play dirty if he wants to come out clean. In 1993's Carlito's Way, starring Al Pacino, Sean Penn, Penelope Ann Miller, John Leguizamo, and a bunch of other familiar faces as well, to round out a great ensemble cast with Brian Palma directing. To me, Carlito's Way is an interesting case study. It doesn't necessarily do anything new in the genre, yet it shows, when all the tropes are done with skillful precision, that the results can be a timeless classic, which I certainly think Carlito's Way is. You first and foremost get the searing performance from Al Pacino that just breathes life, emotion, empathy, and just tons of heart into this gangster. The plot is perfectly structured with just enough subplotting and focal character arcs. No threads are left open. It really gives this movie just an attention-consuming flow. You can feel something is foreboding in the future when watching this movie, and it just keeps you on edge as the events evolve and the characters begin to reveal themselves. Carlito's Way to me is just really a well-made movie across the board, from De Palma's intimate direction to the plotting and the story organization, the pacing. It all just works to lure you in. Then you get a star-studded supporting cast around Pacino that just makes this movie so well acted, and while really not mentioned as much as other movies like Goodfellas, Carlito's Way is a solid go-to in the mob genre. This skydiving-themed thriller follows a maverick jumper and an ex-KGB agent who cross paths with the Russian mob, only to find out that it isn't the fall that kills you in Terminal Velocity from 1994, directed by Darren Sarafian, starring Charlie Sheen and Natasha Kinski, as well as James Gandolfini and Christopher McDonald. If any movie is a product of its time, it would be Terminal Velocity. It's an action movie that goes right through the motions in the genre, from the troubled main character with a sketchy past that needs his redemption, to the unlikely partnering with someone to search for clues, to the planned random feeling of romance between them, and the menacing villains and the one-liners and all the themed action sequences. Terminal Velocity delivers it all to the nines, but there is still something that's just enjoyable and nostalgic about this movie that just relentlessly relied on the theme of skydiving. It's not nearly as good as Drop Zone, but Terminal Velocity is a fun, high-energy thriller that delivers plenty of adrenaline-pumping, albeit silly action. I think Sheen has been better. He's lacking some charisma and enthusiasm in this film, but his pairing with Kinski is a serviceable duo for this by-the-numbers plot. Terminal Velocity is a ride you can take with little thought needed, and regardless of some dated effects, when this movie hits the skies, it is a good time. Next up is a futuristic cyber thriller that now technically takes place in the past, when a cop turned street hustler uncovers a conspiracy in 1999 Los Angeles in Catherine Bigelow's Strange Days, starring Ralph Fiennes, Angela Bassett, Juliette Lewis, and Tom Sizemore. I think many would agree that Strange Days was a bit ahead of its time. It explored social concepts and themes that people really weren't ready for with cinema at the time, certainly not wrapped in an action movie package, but I do think this film has aged greatly over the years. It certainly does have its cult following, but it's not spoken about so often, and outside of Point Break, I think it's Catherine Bigelow's finest work. Strange Days is part futuristic cyber thriller, part social commentary, and part full throttle action flick, and I love how all of these elements blend together into just one wild and vibrant ride to close out the century. The cast is impressive, with Fiennes and Bassett carrying the load from start to finish, but really it's the complete supporting cast around them that fills this film with plenty of interesting and shifty and frequently seedy characters. This movie has an atmosphere to it. It has a gravitas to it. I think the style and the seductiveness of the story really does cross with the grittiness of the tones nicely. And I think 40 years from now, Strange Days will still be regarded as a great movie. This dark comedy follows a couple of law-breaking brothers who find themselves competing for the same woman to comical results in 1996's Feeling Minnesota, starring Keanu Reeves, Cameron Diaz, Vincent D'Onofrio, and Dan Aykroyd, directed by Steve Bagelman. Feeling Minnesota is another of those movies that tries to deliver a bit of it all, and I've always had a soft spot for it. At the core, this movie is a romantic comedy, and even a sweet one in glimpses. However, it kind of feels more like a romantic comedy that someone like Tarantino or David Lynch would make. It just has this sadistic sense of humor that just is slightly reminiscent of a film like Very Bad Things, but just much more restrained, and that's where some may not like this tone. I find it to be a great backdrop for a dark comedy filled with just charming but deeply flawed characters that kind of bumble through love like a bunch of dancing monkeys for your amusement. The grungy atmosphere and these surprisingly common character types just make the exaggeration of all these mishaps and emotional hurdles just pure mindless fun, in my opinion, all of which just hits the heartstrings without ever feeling sappy. And I think Reeves and Diaz and D'Onofrio are great here, and they make this movie the humorous comedy that I think it is. Coming up next is a high-energy comedy about an advertising agent and a petty thief that form an unlikely alliance in 1997's Nothing to Lose, written and directed by Steve Odenkirk, starring Martin Lawrence, Tim Robbins, John C. McGinley, and Giancarlo Esposito. I've always loved this movie. It's certainly more than ridiculous, and the central premise being a simple misunderstanding is just delightfully absurd. This results in a high-energy comedy that just checks all the boxes you want. It has a great duo in Lawrence and Robbins. Robbins is just dejected and feeling his life is lost. Lawrence is full throttle, hyperactive, and together they just deliver waves of comical banter and physical comedy. Nothing to Lose is just a pure comedy film while also being a pure adventure of silliness, and it all just gels together perfectly, from their antics out on the road to their scheme to rob Robbins' boss, with amazing performances from McGinley and Esposito as a couple of nomadic criminals. This movie just has non-stop energy and laughs. I've watched this one countless times. It's always a film that can put me in a good mood, and it delivers a great soundtrack that just locks it in time. And Nothing to Lose is a movie they don't make much anymore, but it's one that can always put a smile on your face. Coming up next, I have a comedy crime caper with a touch of mystery about a private detective and his associate that take on a case involving a shady tycoon in 1998's Zero Effect, starring Ben Stiller and Bill Pullman, as well as Ryan O'Neal and Kim Dickens, written and directed by Jake Kasdan. This movie never really took off when it was released, and it does have its flaws. It was the first full feature film from Kasdan, and his inexperience does show in spots of the direction and some of the story elements that don't necessarily coalesce as well as they should have. Regardless, though, this quirky, offbeat, dark comedy is entertaining for what it is. Zero Effect also does have a unique element to it for the detective genre, and I appreciate this film for doing something a bit different. The performances are strong. I certainly think they all elevate the material, particularly from Pullman and Stiller. I enjoy them together as a duo. I think they play well off one another to effective comedic results. I think it gives this movie really a collection of likable characters, and even if their story had more potential to it, the moody and just slightly eccentric vibe of this story is a charming little escape. This movie won't be for everybody, but if you like energized crime comedies that are a little bit all over the place, then Zero Effect will deliver some fun. This next drama asked, what was your dream and how far would you go and who would you trust when two teenage girls on vacation in Thailand are arrested and sentenced to more than 30 years in prison in 1999's Broke Down Palace, starring Claire Danes, Kate Beckinsale, Bill Pullman, and Jacqueline Kim. Now, this movie does have a few flaws. Its emotional lining is a bit superficial, and the friendship that fuels the focal dilemma of the plot is lacking some of the needed depth. But if you just take this movie at face value, the story of these two girls getting roped up in a smuggling run and losing their freedom will deliver more than enough dramatic intensity to keep you invested. You can just naturally sympathize with these characters for the most part, and the performances from Danes and Beckinsale are more than emotionally charged. Danes in particular is the driving force. Her character is the more fleshed out of the two, and she just pours her heart into this performance. I also really enjoy the supporting cast with Lou Diamond Phillips, Jacqueline Kim, and Bill Pullman. They all just humanize their relatively generic character types nicely, and with the tropical settings, you're just really pulled into a foreign land with these two girls to take their mission. This movie may not have been as good as Return to Paradise, however, Broke Down Palace can still deliver a emotionally intense ride. Now, this comedy may have been known to some of you as The Boyfriend School, but this romantic comedy about a romance novelist attempting to set up her brother who just survived cancer treatment is known to me as Don't Tell Her It's Me from 1990, starring Steve Guttenberg, Shelley Long, and Jamie Gertz. Now, to me, this is just one of those lovable old-school romantic comedies that thrives on a simple premise and the appealing chemistry between its leads. Guttenberg is charming, charismatic, and likable, and rivaling him with her own appeal is the always lovable Jamie Gertz. Then you get Shelley Long, who to me really is the bright spot of this movie and the driving force of the comedic tone overall, as she tries to find love for her brother relentlessly by rebranding him as this tough guy that really just looks like he's dressed up to be an extra for a Def Leppard video. And overall, this movie is just simple amusement. It more than works as a feel-good romantic comedy. It's humorous, it delivers waves of nostalgia and energetic performances. Don't Tell Her It's Me does check through the boxes in the genre cliche checklist, but I don't think it hinders this little forgotten comedy from putting a smile on your face. Gertz and Guttenberg are an appealing duo. Guttenberg and Long deliver the banter of siblings, and this movie just gels together in all the ways you would want from a very quick and easy night with an old school comedy. Now, this could potentially be the most absurd film in this entire series, as it centers on a rapper and his crew who gets stranded in a small town when his bike breaks down and he falls in love with a local. This was a movie that told you to drop the zero and get with the hero, and that hero is Vanilla Ice, and the movie is Cool as Ice from 1991, starring Kristen Mentor and David Gross. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Cool as Ice is a good movie. However, I do think it's a movie that's so bad it's actually quite good. This is just ridiculousness across the board, from the plot, the story progression, the performances. All of it really is a mess, yet there is just something fun about this stupid little movie that I always have fun with when watching. I remember watching this movie so many times as a kid and sort of loving it, but never really admitting it to any of my friends. It was like a live action movie version of some cartoon, and even if the plot progression makes really no sense, the over-the-top cheesiness in Cool as Ice is something that you can just laugh at and have a good time with. It's also just time-locked with waves of sanitized, high-energy 90s dance music, and Vanilla Ice, as silly and absurd as he is here, is just an acting sight to behold. The best thing about Cool as Ice is its quick runtime. It's also able to slip in some intentionally humorous lines here and there to blend with all the unintentional laughs. And Cool as Ice to me will always be a nostalgic timestamp to the gimmick films of the 90s. Coming up next is a sports comedy I recently talked about in another video. This one stars Tom Selleck as the biggest thing to hit Japan since Godzilla when he would get traded in 1992's Mr. Baseball, also starring Aya Takanashi, Ken Takakura, and Dennis Haysbert. I've always loved Mr. Baseball and the blend of genres that it weaves together. This movie is a comedy, it's a romantic comedy, it's a bit of a drama, and it's a thrilling sports action flick, all blended together into a tight runtime. I think Tom Selleck is perfect for this character. He truly feels like a ball player, and his bursts of frustration from being in a new city and on a new team are a blast of laughs. The story here may be a bit predictable, and many of the plot beats are recycled, but it's still able to easily connect the two most important things that it's set out for, the comedy and the baseball. You can easily sit back and just get lost in this movie. Seeing Selleck adjust to how the game is played in Japan is humorous, and when the action takes over the stadium, there's a surprising amount of intensity injected into this movie. I think Mr. Baseball captures the spirit of the game, the thrill of competition, the bond of teamwork, and how loved the game is to the masses. And when it's in the locker room, Mr. Baseball is a capable comedy as well. Then when it hits the diamond, the result to me is just a home run in the genre of sports comedies. Based on true events, this movie tells the story of an Arizona logger who was abducted by aliens and the hardships his friend endure when they are charged with his murder in 1993's Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney, Robert Patrick, Craig Sheffer, Peter Berg, and Henry Thomas. I'll admit, when I was a teenager, I did enjoy the unnerving suspense this movie delivers during its abduction sequences. Those sequences are extremely well made, but honestly, I found the rest of the film to be a bit boring. Then later in my adult years, rewatching this movie, I was surprisingly much more captivated by the story that it explores. Fire in the Sky follows a group of friends. They're just normal working guys going about their day, and then they encounter a UFO, and their lives are changed forever, and it's still a gripping situation to see evolve. One of them is abducted, the others are believed to be accomplices to some sort of foul play, and with the small town vibe of the setting, you can easily get sucked up into the emotional intensity that's just gripping over this community. And then when Fire in the Sky hits the gas and we see this man being worked over by aliens, the result is something that creeped me out as a kid, and these scenes still kind of creep me out as an adult. The pacing still does have its ebbs and flows, but it's extremely well acted and just delightfully unsettling right when it needs to be. Now, this movie sort of does feel like a Carlito's Way knockoff, yet this stylish tale of a drug dealer trying to get out of the game has plenty of its own merits, as Wesley Snipes takes on the role of Romello Scuggs in 1994's Sugar Hill, also starring Michael Wright, Teresa Randall, Clarence Williams III, Ernie Hudson, and Abe Vigoda. Now, Sugar Hill was not so well received by critics when released, and I can't admit that it is a bit more borrowed than it is new, and it's more than just a tad self-righteous, but I still love this movie for what it is. I enjoy Snipes in this character as essentially a toned-down version of Nino Brown. I think the supporting cast with names like Michael Wright, Teresa Randall, and Ernie Hudson give the movie a strong, supporting, and well-acted cast of characters, and I think the added parallel of brothers being in control and their inner dynamics being tested as an effective of enough twist to make this movie work on its own. It's an organized crime film that it does work down the checklist in the genre, but it's also able to add some emotionally gripping family layering to the plot that does elevate the intrigue. I think also Sugar Hill, from the camera work to the sultry jazz scoring and the tailored wardrobes, is a movie that's soaked with style and elegance. It's crossed with stark violence to show that this lavishness comes at a cost, and the result to me is a solid gangster flick that I don't think gets mentioned enough. Probably one of the more underrated movies on this list, the story centers on a young Hollywood assistant who turns the tables on his ruthless producer boss in Swimming with Sharks from 1995, starring Frank Whaley, Kevin Spacey, Michelle Forbes, and Benicio del Toro. Many of you cinephiles out there may know of this movie, but many regular movie fans may not. This is a comedy that just thrives on its mean-spirited sense of humor as a satire on the business side of Hollywood and the manipulation and euphoria of power and control. I think Spacey is just lights out here as a tyrannical studio executive who just treats people like shit. I think Frank Whaley is equally impressive as a young writer hired to be an assistant only to find himself frequently on the receiving end of his boss's just narcissism and rage. I think Whaley really shines as this character that's just slowly ground into rubble before turning the tables to what I think is gloriously comedic results. I do think this movie fumbles the closing just slightly, but it's still a great time when you're kind of in the mood for some just snarky humor. I think much like The Player explored the inner workings of Hollywood, Swimming with Sharks does the same. It pulls no punches. It also dials up the sarcasm, and it results in a movie that I regard as being timelessly funny. Written and directed by John Herzfeld, this one follows intersecting lives and crimes of those in Los Angeles, showing you that anything that can happen will happen when you spend 2 days in the Valley, starring Terry Hatcher, Jeff Daniels, Danny Aiello, Charlize Theron, Glenn Headley, and many other familiar faces. Now, personally, I always enjoy these movies with multiple story layers that all at first seem independent of one another until the writing begins to intertwine them slowly. I think when done properly, the results can often be a clever movie with loads of intrigue, and I think 2 Days in the Valley certainly falls into that category. I've always loved this movie. I watched it so many times in college. I think it's darkly humorous. It's filled with interesting and ever-changing characters. There are just enough twists and turns to keep the mystery engaging. I also think this is a very well acted movie. I love the performance from Danny Aiello. I like Daniels and Stoltz as vice cops. Theron is devilishly fun, and really the entire supporting cast is solid as well, and they're all able to fill this movie with just an array of bold and eccentric characters. 2 Days in the Valley is a movie that to me thrives on its strange tone, where each storyline is more bizarrely amusing than the one before it, and with an LA atmosphere and a story that pulls you all over the city, there's just an undeniable allure to the oddities of all these events that will just grab your attention and take you on a twisted ride in San Fernando Valley. The seedy plot at the core of this mystery movie centers on a man heading out to Vegas to pay off some gambling debts to the mob, but finds that anything that can go wrong will go wrong when he stops in a small Arizona town in 1997's U-Turn, starring Sean Penn, Jennifer Lopez, Nick Nolte, and directed by Oliver Stone. This is another of those seedy little movies where at initial glimpses all seems normal, but not long into the story you see everything couldn't be furthest from normal. If you like bizarre little movies where everything that can go wrong will go wrong, where the main character is just trying to advance but is in a seeming quicksand of hurdles, then U-Turn is a great ride. I think Stone's direction also just elevates this movie with style and visual flair. He brings an atmosphere and just a foreboding edginess to it. It's also filled with great performances. I think Penn is strong in the lead, with Jennifer Lopez and Nick Nolte and Powers Booth and Claire Danes and Joaquin Phoenix just delivering an array of shifty little characters you can't be too certain of. Billy Bob Thornton is fantastic as well and unrecognizable as this greasy mechanic, and really, U-Turn kind of plays like a fever dream where no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to move forward. And for Penn's character being stuck in this ominous little town, the result is just pleasantly unnerving cinema, complete with mystery, unpredictability, and loads of dark humor. This gripping drama centers on a trio of friends on vacation in Malaysia that run into trouble when one of them is arrested for drug possession. The others must decide whether or not to sacrifice their own fate to save him in Return to Paradise from 1998, starring Joaquin Phoenix, Anne Heche, and Vince Vaughn. I think few films explore the power of moral dilemma better than Return to Paradise. This movie, to me, needed to accomplish two things. One, the writing needed to properly frame both the situation at hand, that being the forfeiture of freedom to help a friend facing crimes that you were also a part of in another country. In addition, it needed to seed the threads of the central friendships to make it all mean something. The second thing that it needed to do was deliver a collection of strong performances to keep the mellow out of the drama, and Return to Paradise knocks it out of the park on both pitches. The performances are fantastic. These characters are just real, flawed humans. They are self-preserving. They're a bit egotistical. Vaughn, Hesh, and Phoenix and Conrad all just kill it with their performances. This is a movie that will, I think, kind of have you pondering what you would do in their situations, and it's surprisingly thought-provoking. Something else that works in this movie's favor is the story progression. I really like the timeline of events, how they're chopped up and strung together to seed information as needed with a nice, smooth flow, and to me, this is the perfect movie for a night on the couch that will grab you by the heartstrings and just have your mind swirling for a couple of hours. Coming up next is a military thriller about an undercover detective that investigates the murder of a young woman on a U.S. Army base in 1999's The General's Daughter, directed by Simon West, starring John Travolta, Madeline Stowe, Timothy Hutton, and a bunch of other familiars as well. I won't sit here and say The General's Daughter is a gripping military thriller on the level of something like a Patriot Games or anything like that, but I do think this movie has more positives in its corner than negatives to result in a capable, just below the surface level crime thriller with enough twists and turns to compensate for some of its more contrived moments. I think Travolta is good in the lead. I do think his overinflated personality at times doesn't mix as well with some of the story themes, but he's still capable in the lead and on this case, and Madeline Stowe comes in to sort of keep Travolta as grounded as she can. I do like the supporting cast in this film. I think some of the characters could have been a bit more fleshed out, but in the hands of these skilled actors, they do elevate the material considerably. Now, The General's Daughter does also try to be a bit of an action movie at times as well, and I think it does undercut the peeling of the layers of the mystery in this movie, yet still it's a well-rounded and easily consumable military crime thriller that still holds up after all these years. Kicking this episode off is a textbook action thriller about a young cop paired with an old detective to catch some bad guys in 1990's The Rookie, written by and starring Clint Eastwood, as well as Charlie Sheen, Sonia Braga, and Raul Julia. I couldn't get enough of this movie when I was a kid. I rented it so many times. I'd watch it anytime I caught it on cable. The Rookie was also my first real introduction to Clint Eastwood. I was maybe 12 or 13 when this movie came out. I knew him as Dirty Harry. I'd seen Firefox a bunch of times and his old westerns playing on the TV occasionally, but this was his coming out party for me. This movie is about as by the numbers as you can get, yet I think it does the many tropes well. I think Eastwood and Sheen are a great duo here. They really didn't like one another, and their abrasive chemistry, I think, makes this basic character dynamic between them feel more realistic and much more genuine. The plot is by the book as well, but I think it keeps a quick pace. It works in a blend of character development with a bunch of practical action, and it adds a recycled score to everything to just make it all gel as a fun, procedural, early 90s action flick, complete with a couple of delightfully devilish villains in Julia and Braga, who play up their roles phenomenally in The Rookie shows. Just because you've had the meal before doesn't mean it still doesn't taste good. This wildly bizarre movie follows a couple just trying to head out to the country for a little getaway, but all they ran into was nothing but trouble, from 1991, written, directed by, and starring Dan Aykroyd, along with Chevy Chase, Demi Moore, and John Candy. To say this movie is completely bizarre, over the top, and strange for every minute of its duration would actually be a gross understatement. Now, Nothing But Trouble will certainly not be a movie for everyone. It's absurd, comical insanity throughout. However, there is something to appreciate this movie for at least swinging for the fences and doing something completely unique to its own. I remember seeing a review for this one relating Nothing But Trouble to being a cross between the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Munsters, moments with a full throttle comedic focus, and I would agree, this movie's a blend of gross out humor, juvenile gags, and dumb laughs. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Regardless, seeing Chase, Moore, Aykroyd, and Candy go all in on this absurdity is entertaining for those who enjoy wildly eccentric comedies. The production design and the makeup design are also just so over the top, but at the same time sort of amazing to look at. There is so much going on in this movie, and it's like a sugar rush of stupid comedy, and it's pretty awesome. Next up, I think, is an underrated comedy starring a legend when Eddie Murphy would go from con man to congressman in The Distinguished Gentleman from 1992, directed by Jonathan Lynn, also starring Lane Smith, Cheryl Lee Ralph, Joe Don Baker, Noble Willingham, and a bunch of other familiar faces. This movie did okay at the box office, but was not so well received by critics, and I will admit it does have its flaws. The runtime is longer than needed for the concept, and the direction, I think, is overly simplistic, from the framing of shots to scene intros, transitions, and camera movements. It's all basic direction, and visually, this movie is a bit bland. I think despite that, though, this one is still a great time for those who enjoy skit comedy and silly humor and just watching Eddie Murphy run through his entire comedic shtick. The Distinguished Gentleman is certainly not as flashy as some of Murphy's more notable hits, but seeing him play around in the world of politics with a heavy side of satire is just a lighthearted, feel-good ride of mindless amusement. I think the supporting cast is strong as well, from Murphy's sidekicks to the various political figures that he clashes with on his ultimate con. I think everybody works. They just fill this movie with a bunch of silly, likable, and comically unlikable characters, and with Murphy in the lead, The Distinguished Gentleman, I think, is a great pick for a night at home with an effective early 90s comedy. This time period crime drama follows a normal, hardworking man that will cross paths with a local crime boss who is taking a liking to his son in 1993's A Bronx Tale, directed by and starring Robert De Niro, alongside Chaz Palminteri, who wrote this story, with Lilo Brancato and Terrell Hicks running out the focal cast. This was a movie that just always connected with me as an Italian kid who never met his father. In a way, this movie, I guess, sort of filled in some of the mentorship gaps for me as a kid, as this father finds his son catching the eye of a local mobster. A Bronx Tale is part coming-of-age story about a young boy. It's a part neighborhood gangster movie. It's a part family movie, and De Niro, in his directorial debut, balances all of these themes with a very skilled and seamless and intimate approach. I think the cast is phenomenal as well. You get rock solid performances from De Niro as this working man with generational morals, and you get Palminteri as this charming but deadly mobster. The younger cast is great as well. They just breathe life into these characters, and the result is a movie that just takes you on a neighborhood journey of a young boy that grows into a young man, and the struggle of a father to just keep his son righteous and clear-eyed to the dangers of mob life and not just blinded by the allure of power and money. This really is just a beautiful movie that's able to work inside of the gangster genre, but it takes a side road to tell a story adjacent to organized crime. A Bronx Tale is humorous, it's sweet, it's ominous, it's violent, it's thought-provoking, and I think for the genre, this movie is the complete package. This adult holiday comedy follows a cat burglar who escapes his crime but is unable to escape the small town he's in when he hides out with an ultra-dysfunctional family in 1994's The Ref, starring Dennis Leary, Kevin Spacey, Judy Davis, and Raymond J. Barry. I've always enjoyed this one. Every year when Christmas time comes around, I pop in this silly little movie that just takes all the cliches of the holiday and of holiday movies and turns them all upside down with just waves of irreverent, clever humor led by Leary, who I think is just riding at full speed from start to finish. The Ref goes from being a farce comedy about a burglar who gets stuck in a small town that he just pulled off a heist into being a surprisingly just emotionally depressing drama about a couple who have fallen out of love, and Somehow it all just blends into a wildly amusing Christmas Eve with a dash of emotion. Leary, I think, is perfect for this role, and just seeing him deal with this bickering couple is nonstop laughs. Then you get Spacey and Davis delivering this broken couple to a T. These two really do feel like lovers of one another that have turned to haters of one another with a passion. This all collides with Leary bumbling his way through this seemingly endless night, and the result to me is a movie that's perfect for the holidays after the kids go to sleep. Coming up next is a gripping legal drama about a young public defender who takes the case of an abused prisoner that's accused of killing his cellmate in 1995's Murder in the First, starring Christian Slater, Kevin Bacon, Gary Oldman, William H. Macy, and directed by Mark Rocco. I did have some reservations about putting Murder in the First on this list. It is a film with very notable flaws. It's a movie based on a real-life story about a man in prison, but it has been known that this script took many liberties in massaging the facts for the sake of just dramatic storytelling. Now, this, of course, is done in every film based on true events, but if you read the facts of the story that Murder in the First is based on, then you will see right away it's lacking a lot of accuracy. Now, as a pure film, telling a story and thinking of these people as characters and not as real people, I think does allow the drama of this movie, particularly the performance delivered by Kevin Bacon, to shine through. I think this is really one of Bacon's best pure acting performances, and he alone is worth watching this film once just to see him pour his soul into this part. I think Gary Oldman is also great here, and Slater, while possibly adding a little bit too much sauce on his performance, is strong as well. You can just kind of tell he's acting for an award in this one, but he and Bacon are a good duo, and this is a well-acted drama that can pull you in even if you need to take its story beats with a grain of salt. Coming up next is a little alien mystery about a researcher who finds a signal to alien life and must learn their secrets in The Arrival from 1996, starring Charlie Sheen, Lindsay Krause, Richard Schiff, and Ron Silver, written and directed by David Toohey. Now, The Arrival was a box office flop, and this movie never really caught on. The problem was pretty clear, though. It came out 1 month before one of the biggest movies and most iconic films from the entire decade would be released, another little alien invasion movie called Independence Day. You add this with Sheen's star as a big screen draw kind of fading in the US at the time, and the result would be a movie that just came and went with nary a blip. However, over the years, I do feel this movie has aged extremely well, and I think it still holds up as a smart and inventive film in the genre. I think Sheen gives a real impassioned performance as this researcher that has stumbled onto something extraordinary, and he really carries this story more than capably. And really what I enjoy about The Arrival is how it focuses on the science, the scenario, and the course of action rather than all the visual gusto. It's a thinking movie, yet there's a grounded visual style to it that just gives it a cold, polished vibe, and this is just another of those movies that I don't think will ever feel too dated. This psychological thriller is truly a bizarre narrative involving a musician, a murder, mysterious videotapes, and parallel timelines in the ultra-trippy Lost Highway from 1997, written and directed by David Lynch, starring Bill Pullman, Patricia Arquette, Gary Busey, and Robert Loggia. There's just a sinister appeal to this movie that I enjoy. To me, Lost Highway is close to being a masterclass in surrealist cinema. However, if you prefer concise stories that are direct with their approach, this may be a movie to pass on. But if you dig a film that's just an artistic mess of dreamlike sequences and waves of imagery that just feel irrational and or absurdist with their approach and their delivery, then this will be just a fun, mind-bending ride of eccentric characters and a series of bizarre events that you aren't really sure if they fit. Regardless, The Lost Highway will have you thinking. It's filled with great performances that go all in on the craziness. Pullman and Arquette are great. Robert Blake is perfectly insane as the mystery man. I also love the production design and just the abundance of style that Lynch infuses into this movie. Some would say it's a case of style over substance, and I wouldn't completely argue that, but with this scoring and Lynch's feverish direction and these performances and just the moody atmosphere that this movie creates, it dials up the style in Lost Highway enough to make it worth a viewing at least once. Sticking with a bit of that noir vibe, this movie is about a man who begins to have memories of the past that he doesn't remember. In 1998's Dark City, directed by Alex Proyas, starring Rufus Sewell, Kiefer Sutherland, Jennifer Connelly, and William Hurt. Probably one of the better films in this entire series, Dark City, I think is a feast for the senses. Visually, it's a buffet of cold and bleak and ominous and just alluring visuals as this story takes you into another world with many similarities to our own. Story-wise, this movie is just interesting from beginning to end as it explores these unique characters in this sleek, dark city. The movie is part drama, it's part sci-fi adventure, part noir thriller, and it's just a trippy blast of a ride. I always love sitting down for Dark City. Every time I watch it, I escape into the world and find this just ever-evolving story consuming me regardless of whether or not I've already seen the movie. I think the performances in this one are strong as well, with like Rufus Sewell and William Hurt and Jennifer Connelly and Kiefer Sutherland all bringing life to these roles. And you really have to commend Alex Proyas's just visionary imagination in bringing this movie to a reality. It's just gritty and intimidating, but also a bit seductive. It's a movie that will bring your guard down, then hit you with its mind-bending suspense. And 20 years from now, I still think Dark City will be considered great. This next biopic explores the life of Reuben Hurricane Carter, a boxer wrongfully imprisoned for murder, and those who fought with him to prove his innocence in 1999's The Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington, Liev Schreiber, Deborah Kara Unger, and Clancy Brown. Now, this is a movie that does come a little slow out of the gate, and there are times when you can feel that it's maneuvering itself in the biopic formula rather than just taking some chances. Regardless, The Hurricane to me is a fantastic film that I think rides almost solely on the emotional intensity of Washington's performance. I think this is one of his best outings. I think he should have taken home the Oscar for his performance here. He's able to capture the full spectrum of emotion, from anger to pride to sadness, conviction, and helplessness, you name it. Washington delivers it over the course of this intriguing story. The Hurricane is a movie that explores a man's life while also exploring the injustices at the core of the plot, and I feel the balance between these elements was smooth and continually engaging and frequently thought-provoking, often enraging, yet inspirational at the center. And after this film ends, you'll certainly feel emotionally fatigued because the investment you'll have in seeing how a man fought everybody to try to get his life back. And that wraps up this video, guys. If you're still here, thank you for sticking it out to the end. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate your viewership. I hope you guys have all enjoyed this ride back in cinematic time. Be on the lookout for my next video coming real soon. I hope to see you guys all back for that. And until then, movies never say die.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?